Robert Nishimoto was 71 years old, and he was the kind of person who really appreciated the quiet, simple moments in life. He spent most of his professional career working as a professor of sociology at the University of Southern California. For decades, he was deeply dedicated to his students, his research, and the university community. But when the time finally came for him to retire, he knew exactly where he wanted to spend the rest of his days. Robert decided to move back home to Hawaii. He wanted to spend his twilight years close to his friends and family, enjoying the beautiful tropical breeze, the warm sun, and the peaceful, slow pace of island life. He bought a lovely home with a large backyard and settled into a comfortable, happy routine. On Saturday, November 2nd, 2019, Robert woke up feeling particularly motivated. He looked out his window at his backyard and decided that today was the day he was going to tackle a major outdoor project he had been putting off for a while. His front lawn and the main part of his grass were in excellent shape because he took care of them on a regular basis. But the very back of his property had become completely overgrown. It was a wild mess of thick bushes, heavy shrubs, and tall trees that had not been trimmed in a very long time. Robert figured that on this beautiful Saturday morning, he would head out there and finally clean all of it up. So, he went to his tool shed, gathered up his pruning shears, his handsaw, his gardening gloves, and his other yard working tools, and walked out to the back of his property to get to work. Throughout the day, his neighbors saw him out there. They watched him slowly making progress, hacking his way through the thick branches and clearing out the dense weeds. By the evening, it looked like he was almost finished with the massive job. He had done an incredible amount of physical work, and everything seemed perfectly normal. He waved to a neighbor, packed up some of his things, and went about his evening. But fast forward 2 days later, to Monday, November 4th, Robert had a close group of friends that he met with all the time. On this particular Monday, his friends were sitting at their favorite restaurant in town, waiting for Robert to show up for lunch. This lunch meeting was a regular routine for them, and they always looked forward to catching up. But as the clock ticked past their scheduled meeting time, Robert was nowhere to be seen. One of his friends pulled out his phone and sent Robert a quick text message asking where he was. There was no reply. They waited and waited, watching the door, but Robert never walked in. After waiting for almost an hour and a half at the table, his friends started to get really worried. You see, Robert was not the type of guy who would ever blow off a lunch meeting without telling anyone. He was incredibly reliable and valued his friendships deeply. In fact, he was usually the first person to show up at the restaurant, and he would often tease the others for being even a few minutes late. For him to just not show up and not answer his phone was completely out of character and highly alarming. So the friends decided they would get in their cars and drive by Robert's house just to make sure he was doing okay. But as they turned onto his street, they realized something was very wrong. Down at the end of the road, right in front of Robert's house, there were fire trucks, police cars, and a massive amount of commotion. It turned out that nobody had seen or heard from Robert since Saturday evening when he was out in his yard. His family had been trying to call him all weekend to check in, but they could not get a hold of him. Their calls went straight to voicemail, and their texts went unread. Finally, on Monday, right around the time his friends were waiting at the restaurant, Robert's family had called the local police department to ask them to do a welfare check on him. When the police officer arrived at the house, he walked up to the front door and knocked loudly. There was no answer. He tried the door handle, but it was locked tight. So the officer walked around to the side of the house and made his way into the backyard, searching for any signs of life. He walked up to the back door and knocked again. Still, there was no answer. But as the officer stood there, he noticed that the back door was actually slightly open, leaving a small gap. He pushed the door open, stepped onto the threshold, and yelled inside, calling out Robert's name. No one replied. The officer decided to step inside to look around and make sure Robert was not hurt or in need of emergency medical help. He walked through the home, going room by room, checking the kitchen, the living room, and the bedrooms. Everything was neat and tidy, just as Robert always kept it. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of a break-in, and absolutely no sign of Robert. The officer went back out the back door and stood in the yard, looking around the property. He decided to walk toward the very back of the yard where Robert had been clearing the brush. As he approached the edge of the cleared area, he noticed that some of Robert's yard tools were just lying flat on the grass, as if they had been dropped suddenly. And right next to those tools, there was a strange indentation in the ground. It looked like a small, shallow divot, as if the soil had sunk slightly. The officer was intrigued and a bit concerned, so he started walking across the lawn toward the tools and the divot. As he got closer, he noticed there was a tiny, dark hole right in the center of that indentation. The officer walked up to the very edge of the divot and peered down into the tiny hole, trying to see what was underneath. And then, without any warning, the ground beneath his feet began to give way. The earth collapsed inward, and the tiny hole suddenly turned into a wide, gaping opening about 2 feet across. The officer reacted on pure instinct, jumping backward to keep from falling into the sudden void. He stood there for a moment, his heart pounding, waiting for the ground to stop sliding and settling. Once everything was completely still, he cautiously crept back to the edge of the hole. He took out his flashlight, turned it on, and shone the beam down into the opening. But the light just faded into the darkness. He could not see the bottom at all. It was clear that this was an incredibly deep, vertical shaft. The officer carefully took a few more steps forward, testing the ground with his boots to make sure it was solid and would not collapse under his weight. Finally, he got to a spot where he could aim his light straight down. And that was when his flashlight beam hit the bottom, 22 feet below. Lying there on the floor of the dark chamber was Robert's body. It turned out that Robert had fallen into a hidden lava tube. In big cities, people might worry about falling into open manholes, but in certain parts of Hawaii, the real danger is falling into lava tubes. These tubes are formed during volcanic eruptions. As hot, molten lava flows down the side of a volcano, the top layer of the lava is exposed to the air. That top layer begins to cool and harden, forming a solid crust or shell over the flowing lava underneath. The lava underneath keeps moving, sometimes for months, until it completely drains out. When it is empty, it leaves behind a massive, hollow subterranean tunnel. Over decades and centuries, nature reclaims the land on top of these tubes. Grass, bushes, and trees grow over them, making the ground look completely solid and normal. But right beneath that thin crust of earth is a giant, empty space. Robert had fallen through what is known as a skylight. A skylight is a place where the thin ceiling of a lava tube has weakened over time and left a small hole. In highly populated or touristy areas of Hawaii, these skylights are well known, clearly marked, and blocked off so people do not fall in. But if you go off the beaten path into areas that do not get much foot traffic, you can easily run into an undiscovered skylight. And in Robert's case, his backyard was so overgrown with thick brush and plants that the greenery had completely covered the hole. To Robert, it looked like he was standing on solid ground. In reality, he was standing on a fragile shelf of dirt and roots over a 22-foot drop. While he was working, the ground simply gave way, and he fell to his death. It was a tragic and sudden end to a peaceful retirement. Now, we are going to move from the quiet islands of Hawaii to the deep blue waters off the coast of the Dominican Republic, where we find another individual who pushed the limits of where humans are supposed to go. Her name was Audrey Mestre. Audrey was 28 years old, a French native, and she was one of the most talented free divers in the entire world. Freediving is already considered one of the most dangerous and extreme sports on the planet. For most people, freediving just means swimming underwater without a scuba tank. But for elite athletes like Audrey, it is a completely different world. They take a single massive breath of air on the surface, and then they dive down to mind-boggling depths, staying underwater for minutes at a time before returning to the surface. Within this already extreme sport, there is an even more extreme version called no limits. Instead of the diver taking a big gulp of air and then using their own physical strength to swim down or pull themselves down on a rope, in no limits free diving, the divers are allowed to use whatever equipment they want to get as deep as they can possibly handle. The only rule is that you cannot use a breathing apparatus. The most common no-limits technique is to grab hold of a heavy metal sled that is connected to a bottom-weighted vertical cable. The free diver holds onto the sled, and it is released from the surface. The sled rockets down into the deep ocean to whatever their desired depth is, and the diver just holds on tight. Once they reach the bottom of their descent, the diver turns a switch or a valve which shoots compressed air into a big balloon attached to the sled. Once the balloon is filled enough, the buoyancy pulls the sled and the diver, who is hanging on, back up the cable to the surface. Normally, a no-limits free dive using this technique takes approximately 3 minutes from start to finish. The reason no limits is considered such an extreme version of freediving is because it allows divers to reach extraordinary depths that they physically are not capable of getting to on their own. We are talking about over 100 meters below the surface. There is just no way a person can swim down that deep and back up on a single breath of air without the help of the sled and the balloon. Because of this, if your equipment fails at those extreme depths, it is almost always fatal. On October 12, 2002, Audrey was sitting on a floating platform off the coast of the Dominican Republic, mentally preparing herself for what she was about to do. She was trying to become the best free diver in the world by breaking the world record for the deepest depth achieved by a no-limits free diver, which was 170 meters. That record was actually held by her husband, a famous diver named Pippin Ferraris. But as she sat on that platform, doubt must have crept into her mind because storm clouds began to roll in and the water became rough. In the world of no-limits freediving, where so many things can go wrong, there is no reason to add in another risk factor like bad weather. It could affect the support team on the surface, and it could affect the stability of the cable. On top of that, Audrey was using a new piece of equipment. She had a slightly thinner, lighter cable that her sled was attached to, but she did not know how it would perform on a dive this deep. Furthermore, Pippin, who was in charge of safety for the dive, had been heavily criticized in the diving community. Many felt he was rushing this record attempt and had not done enough preparations. There were not enough medical staff on site, and there were not enough standby divers positioned along the cable. Audrey was well aware of these criticisms. Pippin was regularly criticized because 6 years earlier, 2 separate people on his staff had died during different diving accidents, and people accused him of being reckless. But despite all of these red flags, Audrey was incredibly confident and wanted to go through with the dive. She signaled to her team that she was ready. She zipped up her bright yellow wetsuit, checked her sensors and video cameras, and put on her long fins. Meanwhile, Pippin checked the crucial balloon that would bring her back up. Because this piece of equipment was so vital, Pippin insisted that he was the only one who could touch it, even though normal safety procedures required at least 2 other people to inspect it before a dive. Regardless, Pippin inspected the balloon and determined it was good to go. He signaled to Audrey, and she slipped off the platform into the water, swimming over to the 200-pound sled. Just before she gave the final go-ahead, she performed a procedure called packing, taking a deep breath and gulping down extra air to pack her lungs full. Then, she gave the signal. The sled was released, and she began rocketing down into the deep ocean. Audrey's descent was going perfectly until she hit the 164-meter mark. Because of the bad weather and rough water, the lightweight cable was swaying in the current, causing kinks to form in the line. The sled caught on one of these kinks and stopped. Audrey had to sit there in the dark for 30 seconds until the kink finally straightened out and she could continue down past the record mark of 170 meters. That 30-second delay might not have mattered if everything else went perfectly, but unfortunately, it did not. Once Audrey set the record by hitting 171 meters, she stopped the sled and reached over to turn the valve to inflate the balloon. She turned the switch, but nothing happened. The balloon did not inflate. On the camera footage, you can see a hint of panic in her body language. She was almost out of breath, pushing past her 3-minute limit, and needed to get to the surface immediately. She stayed calm and turned the switch again, but still, nothing happened. At this point, a standby diver noticed the sled was not moving and rushed over. He tried to manually inflate the balloon using his own auxiliary air tank, but there was not enough air coming out to fill it quickly. The sled began to move upward, but painfully slowly. You might wonder why the standby diver did not just give Audrey his regulator to let her breathe. But because she was so deep, the immense pressure had compressed her lungs to the size of small oranges. If she took even a tiny gulp of air at that depth, the air would expand so dramatically as she rose that it would have destroyed her lungs and killed her. All Audrey could do was cling to the sled, rise slowly, and try to hold her breath as long as possible. The video shows her remaining absolutely stoic as she rode the sled, knowing what was about to happen. On the surface, when she did not appear after 3 minutes, Pippin put on scuba gear and jumped in. By the time he reached her and brought her out of the water, she had been without air for 8 minutes and 40 seconds. She had a faint pulse when they put her on the boat, but there was no doctor on standby to treat her immediately. Pippin had also spent a few extra minutes trying to resuscitate her while they were still in the water, which delayed medical care. She was rushed to the hospital but was pronounced dead. The cause of death was drowning. While some believed Pippin had intentionally sabotaged the dive to protect his own record, the official investigation concluded that Audrey's death was a tragic accident. In 1993, after an exhaustive review of hundreds of potential sites across the United States, executives from the German car company Mercedes-Benz made a monumental decision. They announced that Tuscaloosa, Alabama, would become the site of their first ever passenger car assembly factory outside of Germany. This was an incredibly historic day, not just for the executives at Mercedes-Benz, but for the entire state of Alabama. At the time, Alabama had one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation, and residents were desperate for stable, well-paying work. They were hopeful that this new factory would create hundreds of jobs and give the local economy a much-needed boost. But what actually happened next far exceeded their wildest expectations. Immediately following the Mercedes-Benz announcement, 3 other major automotive giants, Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai, all made similar announcements. They revealed that they too would be setting up massive manufacturing shops in Alabama. These 4 major factories did not just bring their own assembly line jobs. They also attracted dozens of smaller factories that supplied the parts needed to build the cars. These supplier factories set up operations all across the state, bringing thousands of additional jobs with them. This single decision by Mercedes-Benz in 1993 ended up creating tens of thousands of new jobs all across Alabama, transforming the state into a massive automotive manufacturing hub. 2 years later, in 1995, a little girl named Regina Elsie was born just about an hour away from the Mercedes-Benz factory in Tuscaloosa. Growing up, the automotive manufacturing industry was a constant presence in her life. Many of her family members worked in the local factories, and as a child, she would sit outside and watch dozens of massive 18-wheelers go by. These trucks were always carrying car parts, heading down the highway toward one of the many assembly plants. Regina was a quiet, reserved, and incredibly sweet kid. She absolutely loved to read, she was an excellent student in school, and she had a deep love for animals. She was the kind of person who could not bear to see an animal suffering. Whenever she found a stray dog or cat in her neighborhood, she would immediately take it in and bring it back to her house to care for it. But of all the animals she rescued, her absolute favorite was her dog, whom she named Cow. Regina had big dreams for her future. She wanted to go to college, study medicine, and eventually become a pediatrician so she could help sick children. After she graduated from high school, she took her first step toward that dream. She enrolled in a local community college on a federal grant with plans to eventually transfer to Auburn University to finish her degree and then apply to medical school. But while she was attending community college, her life took a beautiful and unexpected turn. She fell in love with a local boy named Dan. Remarkably, Regina and Dan had actually known each other since kindergarten, but it was not until they were older that they realized they were meant to be together. Before long, the young couple got engaged and started planning their wedding. They were incredibly happy and wanted to take the next step by moving into a place of their own. But they ran into a very common and difficult obstacle. They simply did not have enough money. Regina was a full-time student, so she did not have any income coming in. Dan was working as a shelf stocker at the local Walmart, making barely above minimum wage. They quickly realized that they could not afford rent, utilities, and groceries on Dan's salary alone. The only way they could afford their own home would be if Regina dropped out of college and got a job too. This was an incredibly tough decision for Regina. She still desperately wanted to become a pediatrician, but at the same time, she was so excited about starting her life and her future with Dan. She thought about it long and hard, and she eventually told herself that she was only 20 years old. She figured she could take a break from her education, work for a few years to build up some savings with Dan, and then go back to school later to get her medical degree. So, in January of 2016, Regina made the difficult decision to disenroll from her classes and start looking for a full-time job. A month later, she landed a job as an assembly line worker at a car parts supplier factory called Agent USA, which was located in southeastern Alabama. This was a factory where her stepfather and one of her sisters were currently employed, and the company supplied parts directly to major car brands like Hyundai and Kia. When Regina told her mother about the new job, her mother was deeply concerned. Her mother had worked at 2 other similar auto parts supplier factories in the past, and she knew firsthand how brutal the environment could be. She warned Regina that it was not a great place to work, explaining that the physical pace was exhausting and the pressure to perform was almost unbearable. You see, car parts suppliers operate under an intense amount of stress. They have strict daily quotas that they must meet for their major clients. If they fail to deliver the required number of parts, even by a tiny margin, they can be hit with massive financial fines from companies like Hyundai and Kia. This immense pressure from the top often filters down to the factory floor, leading management to overwork their employees. Over time, the workers develop a production at all costs mentality. They see that their employers care far more about hitting numbers than anything else, and as a result, they start cutting corners and ignoring safety regulations just to keep the assembly lines moving. But when Regina's mother shared these warnings, Regina listened but insisted that she had no choice. She had bills to pay, and she was determined to build a life with Dan. By this time, she and Dan had moved into a small house in southeastern Alabama, not far from the Agent USA factory. They were living there happily with their beloved dog, Cow. Regina had also bought herself a brand new car, which she was incredibly proud of because she had paid for it with her own hard work. She had also gone shopping and found the absolute perfect wedding dress for her upcoming big day. It fit her beautifully and made her feel like a princess, but it cost $4,000. Because of all of these expenses, Regina was not about to walk away from this job. She needed the money to pay for her car, her rent, and her dream wedding dress. When she first started working at Agent USA, the company put her on temporary status, which meant she was only making $8.75 an hour. In order to make more money and help secure her future, she needed the company to transition her to full-time status. Becoming a full-time employee came with a wage increase of $1.75 per hour, which would make a huge difference for her and Dan. Regina was determined to prove to the management that she was a hard worker and deserved that full-time promotion. To show her dedication, she volunteered to work exhausting 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. For 6 months, she worked this punishing schedule, pushing her body and mind to the absolute limit. But by June of 2016, the constant exhaustion had finally caught up with her. She was completely over it. She drove to her parents' house, collapsed onto their couch, and tiredly told them that she just could not keep doing this anymore. She explained that she was going to start looking for other work, hopefully something part-time, so she could finally go back to school and resume her dream of becoming a pediatrician. Her family was incredibly relieved and excited to hear this, looking forward to seeing Regina get her normal life back. A few days later, on June 18, 2016, Regina went in to work what would be her final shifts at Agent USA. She was scheduled for the day shift, and her specific job that afternoon was to oversee a large automated robot. This robot's task was to weld metal pillars onto the front right and front left sides of car frames, which is where the side view mirrors are attached. The robot was a massive machine looking like a giant, powerful arm protruding from the concrete floor. At the very end of this robotic arm, where a hand would normally be, were 2 sharp welding tips that stuck out about 4 inches each. Because these automated arms move with incredible speed and force, the robot was surrounded by a tall, heavy chain-link safety fence. This cage was there for one reason: to prevent employees from getting anywhere near the machine while it was in operation. Regina's job was to monitor the robot's performance from a safe distance using a computer screen located outside of the metal cage. At some point during the afternoon, as Regina was watching her computer screen, an error message popped up. It indicated that there was a stud fault on Robot 23. Now, Robot 23 was not the machine that Regina was personally responsible for. It was the robot located right next to her station. But the person in charge of monitoring Robot 23 was a member of Regina's immediate work team. Because the entire team shared a single collective quota that they had to hit by the end of the shift, having Robot 23 shut down was a massive problem for everyone, including Regina. If the line stopped, their numbers would drop, and management would be furious. So Regina stepped away from her station and walked over to the safety cage of Robot 23. She spoke to her coworker, and they both agreed that the best course of action was to call the maintenance department and have them come over to clear the error code. A security camera inside the factory was pointing down at Regina's work area, capturing her and her coworkers as they stood outside the metal cage of Robot 23, waiting for help to arrive. But as the minutes ticked by, no one from the maintenance department showed up. It was clear from the security footage that the workers were becoming increasingly anxious. They knew that every single second the robot remained idle, they were falling further behind on their quota. They knew that failing to hit their numbers would result in severe reprimands from management and massive fines for the company. The pressure was building, and the stress was getting to them. At some point, Regina apparently decided that she could not wait any longer. She decided to take matters into her own hands and fix the issue herself. She picked up a small tool that looked like a screwdriver, walked over to the safety cage of Robot 23, opened the door, and stepped inside. She walked directly up to the main stem of the stationary robot. As she did, she turned her back to the massive robotic arm that was positioned right behind her. She leaned in and began using her small tool to work on the stem, trying to manually clear the fault. Whatever adjustment she made, it worked. But it worked too well. The moment she cleared the issue, the machine's computer registered that the fault was gone, and the automated system immediately triggered the robot to resume its task. The massive robotic arm behind Regina instantly sprang to life. It swept forward with incredible speed and force, performing the exact motion it had been trying to complete before it errored out. As the arm swung forward, those two 4-inch metal welding tips at the end of the arm were driven directly into Regina's upper back. The force of the impact was devastating. Her coworkers, who were standing just outside the cage, saw the horrific event happen in real time. One of them immediately lunged for the emergency shutoff switch and pressed it down. But the system did not cut power instantly. Before the robot completely shut down, the momentum of the arm thrust Regina all the way across the inside of the safety cage, pinning her violently against the metal wall. When the machine finally lost power and came to a complete stop, the two welding tips were still fully embedded in her upper back, holding her upright against the wall. She was literally pinned to the wall, suspended off the ground. It was a scene of absolute horror. Regina was conscious, and her eyes were wide open, but she did not make a single sound. She was in a state of profound shock and could not speak or scream. Her coworkers panicked, rushing to the cage door, but none of them knew how to manually release the robot's powerful mechanical grip without causing further injury or turning the machine back on. The team leader realized they needed help immediately. He ran out of the area, hopped onto a nearby forklift, and sped across the busy factory floor toward the break room. He burst through the doors, located a maintenance worker, and told him there was a terrible emergency. He dragged the maintenance worker out, but because they needed to get back as fast as possible, the maintenance worker had to sit on the team leader's lap as they sped back across the factory on the forklift. When they arrived back at the safety cage of Robot 23, the team leader pushed the maintenance worker toward the open cage door, telling him to get Regina down. But the situation immediately deteriorated. The maintenance worker did not speak any English. He was completely terrified by the horrific scene before him, seeing Regina pinned to the wall. He did not understand the frantic instructions the workers were shouting at him, and he had no idea how to safely disengage the robot under these extreme circumstances. As the seconds ticked by, tempers flared, and the panicked workers began shouting at him in frustration. Overwhelmed by the chaos, the fear, and the pressure of the moment, the maintenance worker simply turned around and ran away, leaving the workers on their own. By the time emergency medical crews finally arrived at the factory several minutes later, Regina was still pinned to the wall by the robot. She was still conscious, her eyes were still open, and she remained completely hauntingly silent. The paramedics and rescue workers were eventually able to carefully disengage the robotic arm and lower Regina to the ground. They rushed her to a local hospital, and due to the extreme nature of her injuries, she was quickly transferred to a major trauma center. But despite the best efforts of the medical staff, the damage done to her body by the metal welding tips was simply too severe. Regina died at the hospital, surrounded by her devastated family. An investigation into the tragedy was immediately launched by safety regulators, and what they uncovered was deeply disturbing. It was revealed that Agent USA had failed to properly train Regina or any of her coworkers on basic machine safety protocols. The company's unofficial policy was to hire temporary workers and get them onto the active factory floor as quickly as possible to keep production numbers up. Because of this rush, Regina and her team members had never been taught the vital lockout procedure. This is a standard safety protocol where, before anyone enters a robot safety cage, the power supply must be physically locked in the off position with a padlock. This ensures that even if a fault is cleared, the machine cannot accidentally turn back on while a human is inside the cage. Regina and her coworkers were completely unaware of this life-saving rule. All they had been taught was that the daily quota was the absolute most important thing, and that failing to hit it would have severe consequences. This high-pressure environment is what drove Regina to enter that cage, and it is ultimately what led to her death. Following her tragic passing, the state and federal safety agencies issued severe citations to the company. Agent USA ultimately pleaded guilty to failing to provide a safe working environment and failing to properly train their employees, which directly resulted in Regina's death. As part of the legal resolution, the company was ordered to pay a settlement of $1.5 million to Regina's grieving family. But no amount of money could ever make up for the loss of a bright, kind-hearted 20-year-old girl who had her entire life ahead of her. Her family was left to mourn the loss of a beloved daughter, sister, and fiancé, and her dog Cow was left waiting for an owner who would never come home. It is truly sobering to think about how quickly an ordinary, routine day can turn into a tragic fight for survival. Robert was just trying to clean up his backyard, hoping to enjoy his hard-earned retirement in peace, completely unaware of the fragile earth beneath his feet. Audrey was chasing her dream of becoming the absolute best in her sport, placing her trust in a team and equipment that ultimately failed her in her most critical hour. And Regina was just trying to build a beautiful life with her fiancé, working herself to the bone in a high-stress factory, only to be failed by the very company that was supposed to keep her safe. Their stories serve as a powerful and tragic reminder of how fragile life can be and how quickly the places we go can become traps from which there is no escape. And the terrifying part is, none of these people thought they were doing anything dangerous that day. They all believed they were completely safe right up until the moment everything went wrong. If you want more true stories like these, check out the next video on screen now. This is a story about a brilliant young man who had millions of dollars in the bank, but was so completely consumed by a single terrifying thought that he ended up building a literal maze of death right beneath his own home. And because of his actions, a young 19-year-old man who trusted him with his life would find himself trapped in a pitch-black nightmare with absolutely no way out. To understand how this tragedy happened, we have to go back to the beginning of the story of Daniel Beckwith. Daniel was born in 1,991 inches, Bethesda, Maryland, which is a very quiet and wealthy suburb just outside of Washington, D.C. Daniel was the only child of two highly eccentric and incredibly intelligent parents named Linda and David. His father, David, had a doctoral degree and was a very accomplished opera singer who had actually performed at the White House. His mother, Linda, was a brilliant lawyer who had graduated from the prestigious Columbia Law School and had worked as a high-level government attorney. But Linda eventually decided that the legal profession was far too corrupt for her liking, so she gave it all up to become an opera singer just like her husband. When Daniel was just a toddler, his parents realized that he was not like other children. He taught himself how to read before he was even 3 years old. He had an incredibly high intellect, and his mother became fiercely protective of him. She decided that the public school system was simply not advanced enough to teach her brilliant son, so she chose to homeschool him. By the time Daniel was 5 years old, he was reading thick classic novels, and shortly after that, he figured out how to completely dismantle and reprogram his video game systems. But despite his massive intelligence, Daniel had a very lonely and isolated childhood. He was almost never allowed to go outside and play with the other children in the neighborhood. On the rare occasions that he was permitted to step outside, his parents would hover over him the entire time, watching his every move. And almost nobody from the neighborhood was ever allowed to come inside the Beckwith house. This was because Daniel's parents were severe hoarders. If you stepped through the front door of that house, you would immediately run into towering stacks of old papers, books, rotting cardboard boxes, and discarded food containers. Then, in the year 2000, when Daniel was 9 years old, his father was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. This meant his mother had to take care of both her ailing husband and her young son, and under the immense stress, her eccentric behavior grew much worse. She became completely obsessed with protecting their property. If a neighbor walked even slightly too close to her lawn, Linda would run out of the front door and scream at them until they ran away. But despite how strange they were, anyone who knew the Beckwith family could tell that Linda and David absolutely adored their son. They just could not give him any personal space. One neighbor recalled seeing the family out trick-or-treating for Halloween, and even though Daniel was a teenager by then, all three of them were wearing matching giant hamster outfits. Daniel loved his parents, but as he grew older, he realized how smothering they really were. He wanted to connect with people his own age, so he turned to the internet. He found a community on an anonymous online forum called 4chan. On this forum, Daniel could pretend to be whoever he wanted. He created a tough guy persona, bragging to other users about how he had finished high school by age 15 and spent his free time building explosives in his backyard. But occasionally, Daniel would let his guard down and talk about a deep, paralyzing fear that occupied his thoughts at all times. This was his extreme fear of death. In 2010, it looked like Daniel's isolation might finally end. He enrolled at the University of Illinois to study computer science and electrical engineering. His parents dropped him off at the train station, and as the train pulled away, Daniel felt a massive wave of relief. He felt like he was finally free. But just a few months into his first semester, he received terrible news. His mother had been diagnosed with cancer. She had hidden her illness from everyone, including Daniel, and had refused to see a doctor. By the time Daniel rushed back home, she was in terrible shape, and she passed away just 2 weeks later. Only 3 people showed up to her funeral. Daniel stood there in mismatched clothes and pants that were far too short, looking completely dazed as he gave her eulogy, telling the small crowd that he felt totally lost. After he went back to college, his father's health began to decline rapidly, and Daniel had to place him into an assisted living facility. Living alone in his college apartment, Daniel was completely consumed by grief and a massive escalation of his fear of death. He had seen his mother die suddenly, and now he was watching his father slowly wither away. He went back onto the online forums and talked about taking a defensive position against his own mortality. To do this, Daniel researched the most common causes of death for young men his age. When he saw that car accidents were a leading cause, he went out and reinforced all the doors of his car with heavy Kevlar plates, and whenever he drove the car, he wore a thick, bulletproof Kevlar vest because he believed it would protect his internal organs from blunt force trauma in a crash. He also knew that cancer was a major killer, so he personally went to a doctor and demanded that every single mole on his body be surgically removed as a preventative measure. But the thing that Daniel feared most was not a car accident or a disease. He became absolutely convinced that a nuclear attack on the United States was imminent. He believed the only way to survive was to build a proper underground fallout shelter. Fortunately for him, his mother had left him a multi-million-dollar trust fund, so he had the money to do whatever he wanted. He put his college studies on hold, returned to his childhood home in Bethesda, went down into the basement, and began to dig a massive hole right in the center of the concrete floor. Over the next 2 years, Daniel split his time between his college classes and his secret project in Bethesda. He hired various contractors to come to his home and dig a massive, sprawling labyrinth of tunnels deep beneath his property. But in 2012, both his schoolwork and his tunnel digging came to a sudden halt because of his own bizarre behavior. Professors at his university began to report that someone was sneaking into their offices at night, hacking into their computers, and sending highly inappropriate and embarrassing emails to their entire contact lists of students and faculty. After sending the emails, the hacker would use superglue to seal the professor's office doors shut so they could not get inside the next morning. The university police department investigated the strange vandalism for months. Eventually, several students pointed them toward Daniel, noting that he was a genius-level hacker who had recently spoken at a major cybersecurity conference. A detective went to Daniel's apartment to talk to him, but Daniel did not answer the door. As the detective was standing in the hallway, he noticed a package sitting on the welcome mat. It was addressed to a person named S. Loomis D. Twyler. The detective suspected this might be an alias for Daniel, so he went back to the station and ran the name through their databases. It turned out that this alias was connected to an online profile that had recently been bragging about breaking into university offices and hacking the professors. With this information, the police secured a search warrant for Daniel's apartment. When officers entered the apartment using a spare key, they were met with a scene of absolute chaos. The apartment was packed with towering piles of papers, books, computer wires, trash, and old food boxes. A dirty mattress with no sheets sat right in the middle of the room. On top of a mini fridge in the corner, detectives found Daniel's laptop. It was open and unlocked. The officers cloned his hard drive right then and there, and the digital evidence they recovered proved beyond a doubt that Daniel was indeed the hacker. Daniel was arrested and charged with multiple serious felonies, but right before his trial, his lawyers managed to secure a plea deal. Daniel immediately went onto the website Reddit and bragged to online users that he fully expected the state governor to step in and pardon him because he had donated a large sum of money to the governor's campaign, but that pardon never came. Fortunately for Daniel, the judge gave him a very light sentence. He was ordered to pay $23,000 in restitution to the university and was placed on 2 years of probation. But Daniel was expelled from the university, so he moved back into his childhood home in Bethesda to live alone. With no school to worry about, he poured all of his energy into building his underground bunker. He hired specialized contractors to expand the tunnels, digging deep into the earth and branching out in multiple directions, eventually crossing well past his own property lines. To fund his ongoing project, Daniel turned his attention to trading Bitcoin. Because of his mathematical brilliance, he became incredibly good at day trading cryptocurrency. Within a short period of time, he made millions of dollars. By 2015, his probation had ended and his massive underground bunker was mostly complete. He spent less time trading and more time sitting inside his bunker, live streaming on a popular website called Blab. During these live streams, Daniel talked at length about his investment strategies and how he had accumulated his fortune. But he was deeply paranoid about anyone discovering his real identity or his location. Whenever he went live, he wore a large, heavy fire protection hood that completely covered his head and face, and he used a voice changer to mask his voice. He went by the online username 3-Alarm Lamp Scooter. Among his small but very loyal group of followers was a 19-year-old young man named Askia Kafra. Askia lived in a pleasant, middle-class neighborhood only 15 minutes away from Daniel's house, but he had no idea they were neighbors. Daniel always claimed that he lived in a secret underground bunker somewhere deep in the state of Virginia. Askia completely idolized this mysterious online millionaire. Askia was the son of hardworking immigrants from Trinidad, and he desperately wanted to be successful and wealthy. When Askia turned 18, he had received a $100,000 financial settlement from a childhood lead poisoning lawsuit. For a brief moment, he got a taste of what it was like to be rich. But he was young and naive, and he quickly blew through all of the money on expensive dinners, designer clothes, and renting high-end sports cars like Mercedes and BMWs. Once the money was completely gone, Askia was determined to get it all back. He came up with a business plan to build a new smartphone app called Equity Shark. The app was designed to be a crowdfunding platform that would allow average people to invest small amounts of money into promising new startup companies. Askia was convinced that this app was going to make him a billionaire. But he had no money left to actually build the app. He and his business partner applied for a $100,000 grant for young entrepreneurs who had dropped out of college, which Askia had recently done. Askia was highly confident they would get the grant, but he still had many of the blind spots of a young man learning how to navigate the adult world. His biggest weakness was that he was incredibly trusting, and he was quick to believe anyone who seemed successful. It was during this time that Askia found Daniel's live streams on Blab. He was amazed by this wealthy figure who called himself Three-Alarm Lamp Scooter. When Daniel mentioned to his viewers that he was looking to make some new business investments, Askia saw his chance. He reached out to Daniel and asked if he and his partner could pitch their app, Equity Shark, to him. Daniel agreed. In June of 2016, Askia and his partner went to a local hookah bar to meet this mysterious investor. They had no idea what he actually looked like because he always wore the fire protection hood online. But as soon as Daniel walked through the door of the bar, they knew it was him. Daniel was wearing an incredibly bulky, oversized shirt, and it was obvious to everyone in the room that he was wearing a heavy bulletproof vest underneath it. Askia and his partner simply overlooked this strange behavior, assuming it was just another one of the eccentricities of a tech genius. They sat down and pitched Equity Shark to Daniel. They explained that their success rested on securing the $100,000 grant, which they were absolutely certain they would receive. Daniel was highly impressed by their pitch, and he agreed to invest $5,000 of his own money into their company. But he made them sign an agreement stating that they had to pay him back using the grant money, and if they did not get the grant, they would have to find another way to repay him. Askia was thrilled. He felt that getting the grant was a sure thing, so there was absolutely no risk in taking Daniel's money. Shortly after securing the $5,000, the program manager for the grant called Askia and told him that his company had made it to the second round. They needed to fly out to San Francisco to pitch their idea in person. Askia and his partner were incredibly excited. They immediately called Daniel to tell him the good news, and then they booked their flights. But in their excitement and lack of travel experience, they made a massive mistake. They booked their flights to Los Angeles International Airport instead of San Francisco, which put them 400 miles south of where they needed to be. When they landed in Los Angeles and realized what they had done, they panicked. They tried to rent a car to drive north, but because they were under 25, no rental car company would give them a vehicle. In desperation, they realized they were old enough to rent a U-Haul moving truck. They rented a massive U-Haul and began speeding up the California highway, trying to make it to San Francisco in time for their meeting. But they made another critical error. They entered the wrong address into their GPS, which sent them miles in the wrong direction. By the time they finally arrived at the meeting location in San Francisco, they were hours late. The grant manager was extremely upset and told them to just go back home and wait for a phone call. Back in Maryland, Askia was deeply embarrassed. He confessed to Daniel that they had completely ruined the trip and that they likely would not receive the grant. Askia asked Daniel if he would be willing to invest even more money to help them salvage the app, but Daniel was clearly losing interest in Equity Shark and was hesitant to put any more of his fortune into it. Hoping to stay in Daniel's good graces and prove his worth, Askia offered to do some physical labor for him. He had heard Daniel mention on his live streams that he was looking to expand some of the underground tunnels in his bunker, and Askia offered to do the digging. Daniel was eager to hire him, but he told Askia that because the bunker was a highly classified and secret location, there would be very strict security rules. Daniel explained that he could not allow anyone to know the address of his home because of the imminent threat of a nuclear strike. Askia agreed to all of the rules. On the 28th of January 2017, just after 2 o'clock in the morning, Askia stood outside his house waiting to be picked up. Daniel arrived in a minivan, got out, and handed Askia a pair of heavily modified safety goggles that had been painted completely black so that Askia could not see anything. Daniel then put the goggles on Askia's head, guided him into the passenger seat, and began to drive. Daniel drove in continuous looping circles on the highway and back and forth through various neighborhoods. He wanted to make Askia believe they were traveling to a remote location far away in Virginia, when in reality, they were just driving in circles before heading back to Daniel's house only 15 minutes away. When they pulled into the driveway, Daniel kept the blackout goggles on Askia's face. He tied a string to Askia's wrist and led him like a blind dog out of the van and toward the house. Inside, Daniel carefully guided him through the narrow, cluttered pathways between the massive piles of hoarded trash and papers. They walked all the way to the back of the house, went down the stairs, and entered the basement. In the basement, Daniel had constructed a highly complex maze using chicken wire, stacks of old bicycles, books, and heaps of junk. This maze was specifically designed so that even if a worker came up out of the tunnels, they would be completely disoriented and would not be able to find their way out of the basement without help. Daniel led Askia through this bizarre, dark maze until they reached a gaping hole in the concrete floor. This was the entrance to the underground tunnel system. Only then did Daniel allow Askia to remove his blackout goggles. When Askia looked down into the hole, he was absolutely stunned. He saw a massive, clean, and well-lit network of tunnels stretching out in multiple directions beneath the house. He looked at Daniel in disbelief, asking how far the tunnels actually went, and Daniel proudly told him that the system was enormous. Daniel handed Askia a heavy pickaxe, a shovel, and a hard hat. Then he explained the working conditions. He told Askia that whenever he was down in the tunnels, Daniel would have to place a heavy cover over the entrance hole for security reasons. He also told Askia that because the transport process with the blindfold was so difficult, it would be much easier if Askia simply lived down in the tunnels for several days at a time. Daniel assured him that he would be perfectly comfortable. There was a mattress to sleep on, a strong Wi-Fi connection, plenty of lighting, and a 5-gallon plastic bucket to use as a toilet. Askia was uncomfortable with the idea of living in a hole in the dirt, but he trusted Daniel completely, and he was excited to be working for a millionaire whom he respected so much. So, he agreed. Over the next few months, Askia made the bizarre, blindfolded journey to Daniel's house on a regular basis. He spent days at a time underground, breathing in heavy dirt and dust as he used a pickaxe to carve new paths through the earth. But toward the end of the spring, Askia received the devastating news he had been dreading. Equity Shark had been officially rejected for the $100,000 grant. Askia was completely crushed. He also knew that he now had no way to pay back the $5,000 he owed to Daniel. He asked Daniel if he could increase his hours digging in the tunnels to slowly work off his debt. Daniel agreed. On the 10th of September 2017, Askia was back down in the tunnels. He was working in one of the deepest and lowest sections of the bunker. To reach this area, he had to squeeze his body through a very narrow and tight space. Askia had actually sent a text message to his friends earlier that day, telling them that the tunnel was making him feel incredibly claustrophobic, but he knew he had to keep going to pay off his debt. At around 4 o'clock that afternoon, while Askia was deep in the narrow tunnel, the power suddenly went completely out. Everything fell into a pitch-black silence. Upstairs in the main house, Daniel noticed the power outage. He walked down the stairs into the basement, navigated through his chicken wire maze, and located the main electrical circuit breaker. He flipped the heavy switch, and the power instantly surged back on. But as the power returned, Daniel heard a loud, high-pitched buzzing sound coming from upstairs in the kitchen. He became extremely worried that the sound was being caused by an electrical short circuit that could spark a fire. Instead of checking on Askia first, Daniel immediately reached out and flipped the main circuit breaker back off, plunging Askia back into absolute pitch-black darkness deep underground. Daniel then made his way back through the basement maze, walked up the stairs, and entered the kitchen to find the source of the buzzing sound. But as soon as he stepped into the hallway, he smelled a strong scent of smoke. He turned around and looked back down the basement stairs, and he saw thick, black smoke rapidly billowing up from the basement. Daniel ran back down the stairs and screamed out for Askia. From somewhere deep inside the pitch-black tunnels, he heard Askia's muffled voice yell back, asking what was going on. Daniel screamed for him to get out of there immediately, but the heat and the thick smoke were quickly becoming unbearable. Daniel was forced to run back up the stairs and exit the house to catch his breath in the fresh air. A few moments later, Daniel tried to go back inside. He ran down to the basement stairs, but when he reached the bottom, he did not see Askia. Instead, he saw giant orange flames leaping out of the tunnel entrance. He screamed Askia's name over and over, but there was no response. The heat was too intense, and Daniel had to flee the house. A neighbor saw Daniel standing outside in his yard, screaming hysterically as thick black smoke poured out of the windows of the home. The neighbor immediately called 911. While Daniel was pacing outside, Askia was trapped in a living nightmare. He was deep underground in total darkness. The tunnels were rapidly filling with thick, toxic smoke from the electrical fire. Askia began to crawl desperately through the narrow dirt tunnel, trying to find his way back to the main entrance. Because it was completely dark and his eyes were burning from the smoke, he kept hitting dead ends. But through sheer survival instinct, Askia miraculously managed to find his way back to the main entrance hole. He scrambled out of the hole, gasping for air, only to find himself in a basement that was completely engulfed in flames and thick smoke. This was the moment where Daniel's paranoid security measures became a death sentence. Every single time Askia had been in this basement, he had been wearing blackout goggles. He had absolutely no idea what the layout of the basement looked like. He did not know where the stairs were, and he could not see anything through the dense smoke. He was trapped inside a maze of chicken wire, towering piles of junk, and old bicycles. Desperate to escape the heat, Askia began to scramble over the chicken wire and push past the burning piles of trash. He managed to squeeze past a burning furnace, searching for any sign of an exit. In the distance, through the smoke, he saw a faint glimmer of light. It was a small basement window. Askia rushed toward the window, but as he got closer, his heart sank. Daniel had installed heavy metal security bars over the outside of the window. There was no way to squeeze through them. But Askia refused to give up. In his desperation, he grabbed an old rolling office chair from the clutter, pushed it in front of the window, and climbed on top of it. He used his bare hands to smash the glass pane, hoping he could somehow bypass the bars or scream for help. But the metal bars were set deep into the concrete foundation. They would not budge. After several agonizing minutes of fighting for his life, the toxic smoke overcame him. Askia lost consciousness, fell backward off the chair, and was consumed by the fire. When the fire department finally managed to extinguish the massive blaze, they searched the charred ruins of the basement. They found Askia's body lying directly beneath the small broken window. When investigators first questioned Daniel about why a 19-year-old boy was working in his basement, Daniel tried to downplay the situation. He lied and told the police that the basement was just a cool bachelor pad and that Askia must have simply been asleep down there when the fire started. But as fire investigators began to clear away the debris to find the cause of the fire, they discovered the entrance to the massive underground tunnel system. They were absolutely stunned by the scale of the excavation. As they mapped out the tunnels and examined the basement, they realized the horrific truth of what had happened to Askia. They realized that Daniel had essentially placed Askia into a physical death trap. When the power went out, Askia was trapped deep underground with no light and no way to know that a fire had started. By the time he managed to crawl out of the hole, the basement was already a burning inferno, and because of the chicken wire maze and the piles of hoarded junk, Askia was completely disoriented. The most tragic detail of the investigation was that when Askia was standing on that chair trying to break through the barred window, he was only 2 steps away from a door that led directly to safety. If he had only known which way to turn, he would have lived. But because he had always been blindfolded, he had no idea the door was there. The investigation also revealed that the entire house was a massive fire hazard. Daniel had run dozens of cheap extension cords and heavy-duty power strips from the main house down into the tunnels to power the lights and the Wi-Fi. The electrical system of the old house was simply not built to handle that kind of power load, which is what ultimately triggered the catastrophic electrical fire. Following an intense 8-month investigation, the state prosecutors decided to take action. They charged Daniel Beckwith with involuntary manslaughter, but they also charged him with a much more serious and rare charge in the American legal system. He was charged with second-degree depraved heart murder. This specific charge is used when a person's actions show an utter and complete disregard for the value of human life, to the point where their negligence is so extreme that it is legally treated as an intentional killing. The prosecution argued that by blindfolding Askia, forcing him to work in a dark hole with a blocked exit, and creating a physical maze in a hoarded house, Daniel had created a situation where death was almost inevitable if anything went wrong. They also pointed out that when the power went out, Daniel chose to protect his house from a potential fire by shutting off the breaker, knowingly leaving Askia trapped in the dark while the house burned. During the emotional trial, Askia's parents sat in the courtroom, weeping as they listened to the details of their son's final moments. They described Askia as a loving, ambitious boy who had his whole life ahead of him, but whose trusting nature had been exploited by a paranoid and wealthy man who cared more about his secret bunker than the safety of his workers. Daniel's defense team argued that the fire was a tragic accident and that Daniel had tried to save Askia by running back into the house. But the jury did not agree. They found Daniel guilty of both involuntary manslaughter and second-degree depraved heart murder. He was sentenced to 9 years in state prison. This case left a lasting impact on the quiet community of Bethesda. The massive tunnel system that Daniel spent years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to dig was eventually filled in with concrete by the city to prevent the surrounding homes from collapsing. Today, the property stands empty, a quiet and eerie reminder of a young man's brilliant mind that was completely destroyed by paranoia, and a tragic young victim who simply wanted to build a better life for himself, but ended up trapped in a nightmare. A young man trusted the wrong person, walked into a hidden underground world, and never made it back out. It's one of the strangest and most tragic cases in recent memory. If you want another true story that's just as unbelievable, click the next video on your screen right now. On the morning of Sunday, the 17th of June, 2018, a 35-year-old man named Tristan Baudet woke up early. The first thing he did was grab his phone to check the weather forecast for Orange County, California. Orange County is a sprawling, beautiful suburb nestled between the massive cities of Los Angeles and San Diego. It was here that Tristan, his 36-year-old wife, Erica Wu, and their 2 little girls, who were just 2 and 4 years old, had built their life. And on this particular morning, which just so happened to be Father's Day, Tristan was hoping for good news. He had a plan. He wanted to take his whole family out for a perfect day at the beach to celebrate. He watched as the weather app loaded on his phone and a smile spread across his face. The forecast was for clear skies and sunshine all day. But honestly, even if the app had predicted rain and cold, Tristan probably would have tried to convince everyone to go to the beach anyway. For Tristan, being outdoors was his happy place. It didn't matter if it was hiking in the mountains, camping under the stars, or just tossing a frisbee in a park. If he was outside, he was content. This love for nature was something he had already passed down to his 2 young daughters. They were his little adventure sidekicks, always eager to explore the world with their dad. It made Tristan incredibly happy to see them falling in love with the same things he did. His wife, Erica, she enjoyed the outdoors too, but maybe not with the same level of passion as Tristan. But that was perfectly fine with him. Tristan was the kind of person who just went with the flow. He would make small adjustments to make sure she was comfortable. For instance, whenever they went camping, he was happy to rough it in a tent on the hard ground. But he would always pack a big, full-sized inflatable mattress just for Erica. And it wasn't just about the mattress. It was about his entire personality. Erica adored him for it. He was just so easygoing and accepting of people as they were. He never judged anyone. He was just at peace with the world. In fact, that exact quality was what first drew Erica to him all those years ago. They had met back in high school. Some mutual friends had set them up because Tristan needed a date for a school dance. Erica agreed to go with him, and the night of the dance was the first time she ever laid eyes on him. And he was quite a sight. Over the summer, he had shot up a few inches in height, but hadn't quite filled out yet, so he was tall and very lanky. And for this dance, he was completely overdressed in a full tuxedo, but he wasn't self-conscious about it at all. He was just genuinely excited to be there with a date. And all night long, Tristan owned that tuxedo, dancing with all his lanky, gangly glory as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He made it his mission to make sure Erica had a great time, and she absolutely did. After that night, the two of them were pretty much inseparable. Their lives took them on impressive paths. Erica went on to study at Stanford University and became a successful OBGYN doctor. Tristan became a brilliant and widely published scientist. He even held a patent related to vaccine delivery. On paper, his resume was unbelievable, stacked with achievements, but all that success never changed the core of who Tristan was. His colleagues at the lab, who all loved him, found it hilarious. Here was this genius chemist working on cutting-edge cancer treatments, a guy doing incredibly complex research, who was also this laid-back person who walked around the lab starting most of his sentences with the word dude. By early afternoon on that Father's Day, the Baudet family had made their way to a local beach. Erica settled into a beach chair with a book, while Tristan and the two little girls set up a sunshade right at the edge of the water. They started digging in the sand, building little castles. Every so often, Erica would look up from her book and watch them. She'd see them laughing as they dug. Then they'd suddenly abandon their project and run into the shallow surf, shrieking with delight as they tried to outrun these small, gentle waves that crashed around their ankles. At one point, Erica looked up and saw her daughters having the time of their lives, and then she saw Tristan look over at her. He flashed her this huge, happy grin. And in that one single moment, watching her family, Erica felt a sense of pure contentment wash over her. It was a feeling that didn't always come easily to her. Unlike Tristan, who could just relax and enjoy life as it came, Erica was a constant worrier. This anxiety traced all the way back to when she was just 8 years old. That was the year she lost her father. It was a deeply traumatic event that had devastated her family and cast a long shadow over her childhood. Ever since then, she had lived with a persistent, quiet fear that no matter how good things were, something terrible was always just around the corner, waiting to ruin it all. But sitting there on the beach, seeing that smile on her husband's face, and hearing the laughter of her children, that fear melted away. It was a perfect moment. So Erica put her book down, got up from her chair, and ran to join her family in the water. She had no way of knowing that her deepest fear was about to become a reality. 4 days later, on Thursday, June 21st, the atmosphere at their home was very different. Erica was trying to study for a huge medical exam she was scheduled to take the very next day. But with Tristan and their two energetic daughters at home, the house was loud and chaotic. It was impossible for her to focus. Tristan could see the stress on her face. He also knew that on top of the exam, they were only a week away from a massive life change. They were moving to San Francisco. They had already put a deposit down on a new house up there, closer to some of their family. It was a good move for them, but it added another huge layer of pressure. Looking at his wife, Tristan knew she needed a break. She needed some peace and quiet to study and prepare. And so, he came up with a plan. He decided he would take the girls and get out of the house for the weekend. He made a couple of quick phone calls. A little while later, he went to Erica and told her what he had arranged. He had booked a campsite up in Malibu, California. Malibu is another one of those iconic Southern California towns about an hour-and-a-half drive north of Orange County. It's known for being a wealthy enclave where celebrities live, and he told her that he had also called his brother-in-law, Scott, who had two young sons of his own, ages 3 and 5. The plan was for all of them to go camping together for the weekend. Erica was incredibly grateful. She really did need the time and space to study. But at the same time, a familiar sense of worry started to creep in. Tristan often took the girls on little adventures, but he had never taken them camping overnight by himself without her there. Her first instinct was to object, to say it wasn't a good idea. But Tristan, who knew his wife so well, reassured her. He told her not to worry. He promised he would take great care of the kids. He explained that it was a very public, well-known campground with lots of other people around. He promised it was totally safe. Eventually, Erica was convinced. So Tristan started packing up the car. He loaded in all the camping gear, the kids' toys, and their little bikes. As he worked, the girls were buzzing with excitement about their big camping trip. But Erica couldn't shake a bad feeling. A part of her was silently hoping that something would happen and they would have to cancel the trip. She just felt like something bad was about to happen. But nothing happened to stop them. After the car was all packed and the girls were buckled into their car seats, Tristan came over to Erica. He gave her a kiss goodbye and told her he'd see her in a couple of days. He wished her good luck on her test. And with that, he got into the driver's seat, backed out of the driveway, and headed up the road towards Malibu. Erica stood and watched until the car disappeared from sight. That night, Erica studied late into the evening before finally going to bed. The next morning, she woke up early. She was feeling anxious about the test, and she was still worried about Tristan and the girls. As she was getting ready for her day, she heard a loud, insistent knock on her front door. She glanced at the clock. It was only 6:45 inches the morning. It made no sense. No one should be knocking on her door at this hour. Maybe it was Tristan, but if it were him, he would have just used his key. Apprehensively, she walked to the front of the house and opened the door. The moment she saw who was standing on her porch, she knew. She knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. Erica would later look back on that moment opening the door. And even though it was irrational, she would sometimes think to herself, what if I had just never opened the door? Would this nightmare still have happened? But she did open the door, and standing there was her sister-in-law, Priscilla. Priscilla lived an hour and a half away and was completely unannounced. Her face was frantic and tear-streaked. And then Priscilla gave Erica the most heartbreaking news a person could ever receive. The words were so shocking, so world-shattering, that Erica's mind literally could not process them. She kept thinking, this can't be true. There has to be a mistake. But there was no mistake. Erica would not be taking her medical exam that day. Instead, she got into the car with Priscilla, and they began the long, silent drive to Malibu. The day before, Tristan and his two little girls had arrived at the entrance to Malibu Creek State Park. When you think of Malibu, you probably picture mansions on the beach. But just inland from the coast, the landscape changes dramatically. It becomes rugged and wild, full of deep canyons and dense forests. And nestled right in the middle of all this wilderness is the state park. Tristan and his brother-in-law Scott pulled up to the gate, checked in with the park rangers, and were given directions to their campsites. They had reserved 2 spots right next to each other. A campsite in a place like this is usually just a simple, square plot of dirt, maybe with a fire pit. It's just enough space to pitch a tent. So Tristan and Scott drove across the campground to their assigned spots. But as soon as they got there, Tristan realized the spots weren't very good. They were located right next to the portable toilets, so there was a bit of a smell, and a lot of people were walking back and forth. The ground was also on a slight slope, which would make sleeping uncomfortable. It just wasn't ideal. Scott agreed, so he decided to go back and talk to the rangers to see if they could move. He drove back to the entrance, spoke with a ranger, and it turned out to be no problem at all. The ranger told him there were 2 other open sites on the far side of the park, and they could just swap their reservation. So, Tristan and Scott packed everything back up and drove over to the new spots. And these ones were perfect. They were tucked away at the base of a huge sloping canyon wall, far from any bathrooms or foot traffic. It felt private and secluded, and the ground was perfectly flat. The 2 men were thrilled. They started unloading their cars and setting up their tents, while the 4 kids ran around playing and riding their small bikes. Once the tents were up, they built a fire in the fire pit, which was situated right between the 2 campsites. Scott would be sleeping in his tent with his 2 sons, and Tristan would be in his tent with his 2 daughters. As the sun went down, they all gathered around the fire. They roasted hot dogs and made s'mores, that classic camping treat of marshmallows, chocolate, so graham crackers. The dads told funny jokes and some not too spooky stories. Before long, all 4 kids were completely exhausted. So Scott and Tristan each took their own children and tucked them into their sleeping bags inside the tents. After the kids were settled, the 2 men came back out to the fire. Tristan had brought some pre-made cocktails, and he shared one with Scott. They sat there for a while, just enjoying the quiet of the night and each other's company. Tristan talked a lot about the upcoming move to San Francisco, and Scott was happy to just sit and listen. Eventually, they were both tired too. They decided it was time to call it a night. They carefully put out the fire. Scott gave Tristan a hug and told him he loved him. Then the 2 men went to their separate tents. As Scott climbed into his tent with his sleeping sons, he looked across the now dark fire pit towards Tristan's tent. He could just make out the silhouette of Tristan climbing inside with his girls. After seeing that, Scott zipped up his own tent, lay down, and within about 15 minutes, he was fast asleep. Just before sunrise the next morning, around 4:45 a.m., Scott suddenly woke up. He thought he had heard a loud noise, but he was groggy and couldn't quite place what it was. He lay there in the dark, listening. And as he got his bearings, he realized that one of Tristan's daughters was crying in the other tent. Now, this wasn't immediately alarming. Kids cry. He figured Tristan would comfort her in a minute, and she would go back to sleep. But the crying didn't stop. It just continued. Scott knew that Tristan was a notoriously heavy sleeper, so he started to think, okay, maybe he just hasn't woken up yet. That must be why he's not calming his daughter down. So, Scott carefully got out of his sleeping bag, trying not to wake his own sons. He unzipped his tent and stepped outside. The air was cold, and it was still dark. He couldn't see anything inside of Tristan's tent. He walked over to it, and by the time he got there, he could hear Tristan's daughter still crying, clear as day. Scott called out in a loud whisper, "Hey, Tristan. Tristan, wake up!" But there was no response. Nothing. With the little girl still crying just on the other side of the thin nylon wall, Scott decided he had to look inside. He walked around to the front of the tent, found the zipper, and pulled it open. He peered inside, but it was too dark to see clearly. But even in the dim pre-dawn light, he could make out the shapes. He could see Tristan lying still in the middle of the tent. On either side of him were his 2 daughters. It looked like the 2-year-old was the one who was crying, and the 4-year-old was awake too, whimpering and trying her best to comfort her little sister. As Scott was trying to figure out what was going on, the 2 little girls turned and looked up at him. When they saw him, they both started saying the same word over and over. Wet. 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 Scott had no idea what they meant. He was starting to feel a surge of panic. He knew something was very wrong. He reached into the tent and started shaking Tristan's shoulder, saying, "Hey, wake up," but the second he touched him, he knew. He knew instantly. Tristan wasn't sleeping. Tristan was dead. And his 2 little girls were sitting right next to him in a pool of his blood. Just before Scott had woken up, Someone, somewhere nearby in the darkness of the park, had fired a gun. One of the bullets from that gun had traveled through the night, pierced the thin wall of Tristan's tent, and had struck him directly in the head as he slept peacefully between his two daughters. About 2 hours after that, Priscilla arrived on Erica's doorstep to tell her what had happened. To tell her that her husband was gone and that her two little girls were now going to grow up without a father, just like she did. The news didn't just break Erica's heart, it completely shattered her world. A 42-year-old man named Anthony Rauda was eventually arrested and charged with Tristan's murder. Rauda had a long and violent criminal history, and at the time of the shooting, he was living illegally off the grid, deep in the canyons of that very same park. When police finally caught up to him, he was in possession of a rifle. And ballistics tests later confirmed that it was the same rifle that had fired the bullet that killed Tristan. His trial has been a long and difficult process. It's been repeatedly delayed because Rauda keeps firing his defense attorneys. Although he insists that he is innocent, his behavior in court has done nothing to help his case. He has been so violent and erratic during his court appearances that he has to be strapped into a special chair by his wrists and legs. They even have to put a device called a spit hood over his head to stop him from spitting at or biting people. Assuming that he was the shooter, which the evidence strongly suggests he was, the motive appears to be completely random. It's believed he didn't know Tristan at all. He just, for whatever reason, fired his gun that night. Maybe he was firing recklessly into the darkness, or maybe he intentionally aimed at the tent. We don't know for sure. But either way, one of his bullets found its target, and Tristan Baudet was killed simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if the story wasn't already tragic enough, one more detail emerged that made it even more distressing. Tristan's death was not the first shooting to happen in or around Malibu Creek State Park. In the year leading up to his murder, there had been an astounding 6 other shootings in the immediate area. And 2 of those shootings happened inside the very same campground where Tristan was killed. None of those other shootings had been fatal, but in all 6 cases, the person or people responsible were never caught. And it seemed the local police hadn't put much effort into investigating them. It wasn't until a father was killed in his tent next to his children that the stories of all these other unsolved shootings finally came to light. People started looking at a map and connecting the dots. They realized there was a pattern. There was a rogue shooter who had been active in that exact area for a year, and the public had never been warned. The campground was never closed. No one was told that there was a potential danger lurking in the wilderness there. And the big question everyone had was, why? We may get answers to those questions during Anthony Rauda's trial, where he's being charged not only with Tristan's murder, but for all those other shootings as well. In the meantime, Erica has filed a $90 million lawsuit against several government agencies. Her lawsuit argues that her husband had no idea about the threat that existed in that park. If the authorities had just put up a single sign, a single warning to the public, Tristan, being the protective father he was, would have never ever taken his children there. And he would still be alive today. That lawsuit is still ongoing. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Before dawn on a quiet Saturday in March of 1997, a police captain was making his final patrol through the sleeping outskirts of a small town in North Carolina. The road, a stretch of highway that connected the town to the larger city of Charlotte, was almost completely empty. But up ahead, the captain saw something that didn't belong. There was a red Jeep parked oddly on the shoulder of the road, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. It was just sitting there. This was suspicious enough for the captain to slow down and pull his patrol car in behind it. He got out, the air cool and still, and started walking towards the Jeep. As he got closer, he could hear the low hum of the engine. It was still running. He saw the driver's side window was all the way down. But when he walked around to that side of the vehicle and shined his flashlight inside, he saw that nobody was there. The driver's seat was empty. The whole car was empty. He stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. And then a sound cut through the quiet. A cell phone, sitting on the passenger seat, began to ring. In the early morning hours of Saturday, the 29th of March 1997, a 26-year-old waitress named Kim Medlin was finishing up her shift. She worked at a topless bar in Charlotte called the Men's Club, and tonight she was wearing a leotard and tights as she carried a tray of filet mignons through the bustling, smoke-filled room. She navigated past the main stage, where women were dancing, and delivered the food to a table of businessmen. Kim worked here 3 or 4 nights a week, and for the most part, she didn't mind the job. The money was very good, and working the late shift meant her days were completely free. That freedom was important, because it let her focus on the 2 things she loved most in the world: taking care of her horses and turning her brand new house into a home. Kim and her husband Bridger had just achieved a major life goal. They'd bought a beautiful 7-acre plot of land just outside the nearby town of Monroe, which was where Bridger had grown up. They spent the better part of the last year building their dream home from the ground up. They even built a barn for their 3 horses. Now, with all the heavy construction finally done, they were in the middle of moving in, unpacking boxes, and making the place their own. As Kim delivered the stakes, she glanced up at a clock on the wall. She saw she had less than an hour to go, and a little wave of excitement went through her. She had the next 3 days off, and she had big plans. Simple plans, but they were all that mattered to her. She was going to finish unpacking the last of the boxes and finally start hanging pictures on the walls. She flashed the businessmen a quick, professional smile and then moved on to check her other tables. An hour later, just a little after 2 in the morning, Kim walked out the back entrance of the club. She'd changed out of her work uniform and was now wearing a comfortable, baggy sweatshirt. She called out a quick goodbye to a few of her coworkers who were lingering outside, and then walked over to her red Jeep parked along the side of the building. She climbed inside, tossed her purse onto the cow print seat cover on the passenger seat, started the engine, and turned on some music for the hour-long drive home. About 30 minutes later, Kim was driving south down Old Charlotte Highway. It was a secluded 2-lane road that was pretty much completely deserted at this time of night. She used to find this part of her commute relaxing, a quiet time to decompress after a long shift. But lately, driving this road alone late at night had started to make her nervous. The reason was because just a couple of weeks earlier, while driving home from work around this exact same time, she'd been involved in a really scary road rage incident. Another car had come up fast from behind her and started tailgating her aggressively. They were flashing their lights and honking their horns over and over again for absolutely no reason. Kim had been terrified. She thought maybe it was a customer from the club who had followed her, and her mind started racing with all the terrible possibilities. It freaked her out so much that when she saw the lights of a convenience store up ahead, she immediately pulled into the parking lot. Her heart was pounding, but then she felt a huge sense of relief. There was a police car parked right there. She didn't hesitate. She got out of her Jeep and went straight over to the officer to explain what had just happened and ask for help. He was very kind and took her seriously. He promised he would go try to track down the driver who had been harassing her. He even sent out a broadcast over the police radio telling all the other officers on duty to keep an eye out for Kim's red Jeep on the night she was working, just in case anyone ever gave her trouble again. The road rager was never caught, but knowing that the local police were aware of her situation and were looking out for her did make Kim feel a little bit better. Still, the fear lingered. The person was still out there. So tonight, as she drove down that same dark, empty highway, she decided to do something to calm her nerves. She reached into her purse, fished out her cell phone, and called her husband, Bridger. When Bridger answered, he told her he was actually on the road too. He worked as a DJ, and tonight he'd had a gig at a high school prom in a town about 2 hours away. He was just finishing his own drive home. They chatted for a few minutes, the easy conversation of a married couple just checking in. Then, Bridger told Kim that he was just pulling into their driveway. He said he would run inside, get settled, and call her right back. Kim agreed, said goodbye, and they hung up. She kept driving, feeling a little more at ease now. About 15 minutes passed. It was now a little before 3 in the morning. Her phone rang again. Just as he promised, it was Bridger calling her back from the house. He asked her where she was, if she was close. She told him she was just passing the Union Station restaurant, a local landmark. That meant she was only about 20 minutes away from home. Bridger said he was exhausted from his long night and was about to head to bed. Just in case he was already asleep by the time she walked in the door, he wished her a good night. Kim said goodnight back, told him she loved him, and then she hung up the phone, placing it down on the passenger seat beside her purse. She turned her full attention back to the dark road ahead. But just as she did, a sudden, blindingly bright light filled her car. She instinctively glanced up at her rearview mirror and saw a pair of headlights right on her tail. An hour later, Bridger Medlin sat up in bed. He looked over at the clock on his nightstand. It read 3:59 a.m. It had been a full hour since he'd spoken to Kim. She should have been home 40 minutes ago. She was only 20 minutes away when they talked. A knot of worry started to form in his stomach. He got out of bed and walked through their new 2-story house, checking every room, calling out her name, but Kim wasn't there. There was no sign that she had ever come home. Bridger looked out the front window. Her red Jeep wasn't in the driveway either. Now he was starting to panic. He hurried into the kitchen, picked up the landline, and dialed Kim's cell phone number. The phone rang a few times, and then a man's voice answered. It wasn't a voice he recognized. Confused, Bridger asked who was speaking. The man on the other end told him he was a police officer with the Monroe Public Safety Department. Bridger's heart sank. He asked the officer, "Okay, well, where's my wife?" The officer's reply was not reassuring. He told Bridger that he didn't know where his wife was. He had just come across a red Jeep idling on the side of the highway. He found the phone inside, and when it started ringing, he just answered it. But as for the driver, he said, "There's nobody here." A few minutes later, so a little after 4 a.m., on March 29th, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk, an investigator with the Monroe Public Safety Department, was driving north along Old Charlotte Highway. He drove past the closed businesses and dark houses until he reached the very edge of town. And then he saw it. Up ahead, a red Jeep parked on the shoulder of the opposite side of the road. There was a patrol car parked right behind it, its lights quietly flashing. Hulk made a U-turn and pulled his own car onto the shoulder. As he got out, he saw Captain David Simpson standing there waiting for him. Simpson quickly filled him in. He'd found the Jeep idling there about 15 minutes ago. Headlights on, engine running, but totally empty. He said he was about to call it in when the cell phone on the passenger seat started to ring. He answered it on instinct, and it was a man named Bridger Medlin, frantically looking for his wife, Kim. Captain Simpson also told Hulk something else that was important. He said he actually recognized the Jeep. He remembered it from a strange run-in he'd had just 2 weeks earlier, outside a convenience store with Kim Medlin herself. He put 2 and 2 together. This was definitely Kim's car, but Kim was nowhere to be found. The name Kim Medlin also rang a bell for Assistant Chief Hulk, but for a different reason. He actually happened to be personal friends with her husband, Bridger. This case was already personal. Hulk pulled out his flashlight and began to carefully look inside the Jeep. Right away, he saw a wallet lying open on the passenger seat. He picked it up and looked inside. There were credit cards and there was cash. But the clear plastic slot in the wallet, the spot where you'd slide in your driver's license, was empty. It looked like the license had been deliberately taken out. The initial theory that popped into their heads was a traffic stop. Maybe Kim got pulled over by an officer and had taken her license out to hand it over. But in a small department like Monroe's, there were only a handful of officers on duty at this hour. Hulk asked Captain Simpson if any of the on-duty officers had reported pulling someone over that night. Simpson was already ahead of him. He had already checked. And the answer was No. None of their officers had made a traffic stop. This immediately made Hulk wonder about something else. Maybe Kim had been pulled over by someone posing as a cop. These so-called blue light bandits weren't common, but there had been reports over the years of criminals using flashing lights to pull over and harass drivers, especially young women driving alone. It was a disturbing thought, but those cases were rare. Hulk didn't want to jump to any conclusions just yet. Just then, Hulk heard the rumble of a truck engine and saw another set of headlights approaching up the highway. He set the wallet back down in the seat and walked over as a black pickup truck pulled to a stop right behind his car. A tall man with blonde hair jumped out of the driver's seat. Hulk knew him immediately. It was his friend and Kim's husband, Bridger. Bridger looked frantic, his eyes wide with fear and panic. He rushed towards Hulk, demanding to know what had happened to his wife. Hulk tried to calm him down, explaining that they were there to figure that out. He told Bridger what they had found so far, just the car, with no broken windows, no slashed tires, no obvious signs of a struggle. He suggested that it was possible Kim had just run into some car trouble and had walked off to find help. But Bridger wasn't listening. Without asking for permission, he pushed right past Hulk and climbed directly into the driver's seat of the Jeep. He said, "Well, let's test your theory right now and see if the car was working." Hulk, stunned, told him to get out of the Jeep, that it was a potential crime scene. But Bridger completely ignored him. He put his wife's car in drive and moved it forward a few inches. Then he put it in reverse and backed it up, parking it right back in its original spot. He'd just proven the car worked perfectly fine. And in the process, he had potentially destroyed any evidence that might have been there. Hulk was annoyed, but he also couldn't help but think, this is very bad. Whatever happened here, it wasn't car trouble. Something was seriously wrong. Hulk walked over to his patrol car and radioed the dispatcher for reinforcements. He specifically asked for a police dog so they could try to track Kim's scent in case she had left the area on foot. A few minutes later, 2 more police cars arrived, and a few officers and a canine handler with his dog got out. Hulk opened the doors to the Jeep, and the dog jumped inside, sniffing around the seats and the floor, getting familiar with the scent of Kim and her belongings. After a moment, the dog seemed to pick up a trail on the ground next to the car. The officers told Bridger, who was pacing back and forth and clearly wanted to follow them, to stay put by his truck. Then, they followed the dog as it led them down the dark road for about 100 yards. Then, the dog made a sharp turn onto a long, private driveway. Hulk and the other officers followed the dog up the driveway, which led towards a small house nestled among some trees just off the highway. The dog sniffed all the way up to the garage of the house, and then it stopped. The trail ended right there. Hulk went up to the front door of the house and rang the doorbell. A minute later, a man answered. Despite the late hour, he looked wide awake, and he didn't seem particularly surprised to see a group of police officers on his doorstep. Hulk asked the man for his name and if he had seen or heard anything unusual in the past couple of hours. The man said his name was Nathan Hargett. He told them that about an hour ago, maybe around 3:45 a.m., he'd been woken up by the sound of a strange car loitering near his garage. Nathan said he hadn't recognized the car, but he did notice that it had Texas license plates. He also told them he'd seen a woman with blonde hair in the back seat. Hulk asked Nathan for permission to search his property, and Nathan immediately agreed. Hulk directed the other officers to search inside the house while he went over to the garage. He found a side door on the garage and tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open and shined his flashlight inside. But all he saw was a pickup truck and some gardening tools. There was no sign of Kim. By the time the sun started to rise around 6 a.m. that morning, this was officially a missing persons case. Police, with the help of concerned members of the community, began a massive search of the woods and fields surrounding Old Charlotte Highway. Meanwhile, Hulk and Captain Simpson went back to the police station to speak with one of the dispatchers who had been on duty the night before. After interviewing Nathan Hargett and searching his property, they had ruled him out as a suspect. So now, their focus shifted to that mysterious car with Texas plates that Nathan had seen. They were hoping that maybe there had been a report of a traffic stop or a call about a suspicious car in the area, anything at all that might help them figure out who was driving that vehicle. But the dispatcher told them the same thing. It had been a quiet night, no stops, no suspicious vehicle reports. However, she said, there had been one minor incident in the area that night. It was around 2 a.m., which was about an hour before Kim was last heard from. They had gotten a call about a car that had run into a ditch not too far from where Kim's Jeep was ultimately found. Hulk asked which officer had responded to that call. The dispatcher said it was car 491, which was driven by a young rookie officer named Josh Griffin. Hulk immediately got Officer Griffin on the phone. He asked him if he had seen or heard anything unusual while he was out there responding to the car in the ditch. But Griffin said no. He explained that his shift was technically already over when a driver had flagged him down for help. So he had just called for a tow truck, and when it arrived a little after 2:30 a.m., Griffin said he simply went home. Hulk hung up the phone, feeling disappointed. Bridger had said the last time he spoke to Kim was around 3 a.m. If the car in the ditch was already being towed away by 2:30, then it definitely wasn't the same car that Nathan saw outside his garage an hour later. And the driver of that car was likely not involved. Hulk sighed in frustration. But then, another idea occurred to him. He asked Captain Simpson to tell him more about that random run-in he'd had with Kim 2 weeks earlier. It felt like a long shot, but Hulk wondered if maybe the same driver from that road rage incident could have come back, found her again, and maybe chased her off the road. Simpson said he would go dig up the report he had filed on the incident and left to go find it. About half an hour later, Hulk sat at his desk reading through a copy of the police report. It stated that in the very early morning hours of Saturday, March 15th, exactly 2 weeks before Kim's disappearance, Kim had pulled into a convenience store and flagged down Captain Simpson and another officer who was with him, an officer named Roger Griffin. It turned out that Officer Roger Griffin was actually the father of Josh Griffin, the rookie officer who had responded to the car in the ditch. The report went on to say that Simpson and his partner, Roger Griffin, had actually managed to catch up with the car that had been harassing Kim a little further down the road. There were 2 men inside, Eric Williams and George Connell. They claimed that they thought Kim was the one harassing them by flashing her high beams. To Simpson and Griffin at the time, it had all seemed like a big misunderstanding, so they had just let the 2 men go with a warning. But Hulk, looking at this report through a very different lens now, felt that he needed to speak with Eric and George, regardless of what the report said. He found their contact information and called them both. But it turned out both men had rock-solid, airtight alibis for the entire night of Kim's disappearance. Still, something about it bothered Hulk. It struck him as an incredible coincidence that Kim had gone missing from her car on the exact same road at the same time of night and on the same night of the week as the road rage incident just 2 weeks prior. He had a very hard time believing it was all just a coincidence. The next day, just after sunset on Sunday, March 30th, Hulk was driving down Westwood Industrial Drive. It was a deserted, dead-end street at the edge of town, about 2 miles from where Kim's Jeep had been found. As he drove, he saw a couple of police cars parked at the end of the street. He pulled his own car in behind them and got out. He walked into the woods, following the beams of several flashlights that were moving around in the darkness. As he got closer, he saw officers putting up yellow police tape around a small clearing. And then, on the ground in the center of that clearing, he saw a pair of feet in sneakers poking out from underneath a messy pile of roofing shingles and tree branches. The police had gotten a call earlier that evening from 2 men. They were part of the community search effort for Kim, and they had told the dispatcher that they had found a body in the woods at this spot, but that they hadn't touched anything. Now, with Hulk on the scene, the forensics team began to carefully remove the shingles and branches that were covering the body. Hulk pulled out his own flashlight and knelt down to get a better look. He saw immediately that it was a deceased woman. And there was no doubt in his mind that it was Kim Medlin. She was only wearing a pair of shorts, a bra, and a sweatshirt that had been violently pulled up over her head. One side of her face was very badly beaten. There were cuts and bruises all over her neck and scrapes on her knees consistent with a struggle. He noticed that her necklace and her wedding ring were still on. This wasn't a robbery. Hulk stood back as the forensics team worked. They carefully untangled Kim's sweatshirt from around her wrists so they could take clippings of her fingernails just in case she had managed to scratch her killer and leave behind a trace of their DNA. As Hulk watched one of the forensics officers get ready to put the sweatshirt into an evidence bag, he suddenly noticed something and shouted for the officer to stop. Hulk stepped closer and shined his flashlight directly onto the fabric of the sweatshirt. And there, illuminated in the beam of light, was a clear, distinct shoe print. He immediately told the officers to send that sweatshirt directly to the crime lab and see if they could figure out the size and the type of shoe that had left that print. He knew he would have to wait for those results, but he already had a couple of other big clues to help him narrow down a list of suspects. The first was the location of Kim's body. Westwood Industrial Drive was known locally as a lover's lane, a secluded, out-of-the-way spot where people often went to be alone. The fact that Kim's killer had thought to bring her body here meant they were probably a local, someone who knew the area well. It was still theoretically possible that she'd been run off the road by a random stranger, or that a customer had followed her home from work, or even that it was a blue light bandit. But the second big clue pointed away from a stranger. There was no sign of a struggle at Kim's Jeep. Because of that, Hulk didn't think she had been kidnapped by a stranger. He thought it was far more likely that she had willingly gotten out of her car for somebody that she knew and trusted. The very next day, Monday, March 31st, Hulk sat down in an interrogation room across from his friend and his first official murder suspect, Kim's husband, Bridger. From the very beginning, Bridger had been overly involved in the investigation. He had contaminated the crime scene by getting into the Jeep without permission. And now, Hulk had received information that Bridger had lied about his alibi. When Kim first went missing, Bridger had told the police that he got home around 2:30 that morning, called Kim for a brief chat a little before 3, and then immediately went to bed. But now, another police officer had told Hulk that he had personally seen Bridger's black pickup truck driving around the center of town around 2:30 a.m., which was nowhere near Bridger's house and not on the route he would have taken home from his DJ gig. As soon as Hulk sat down, he could see that Bridger was visibly distraught. He had just learned that his wife had been found murdered. But Hulk had a job to do. He cut right to the chase. He told Bridger that another officer had seen his truck in town, that it contradicted his alibi, and he asked him, "Why did you lie?" Immediately, Bridger exploded. He was furious. He shouted at Hulk, saying he couldn't believe that at a time like this, Hulk would accuse him of lying. He was insinuating that he had hurt his own wife. He yelled that he didn't do this. He also shouted at Hulk for wasting precious time looking at him as a suspect when there were so many other clues pointing to a different story. He brought up the lack of a struggle at the Jeep, the rolled-down window, and the missing driver's license, all of which, he argued, made it look like a traffic stop that had gone horribly wrong. Bridger said he knew Kim better than anyone, and she would never, ever get out of her car in the middle of the night for a stranger, especially not after that terrifying road rage incident just 2 weeks earlier. She was on edge. She just wouldn't have done it. When Hulk left the interrogation room a few minutes later, he told his team to track down any and all security footage they could find from around town on the night Kim was killed. They needed to see if there was any proof that Bridger was really driving around when he claimed he was at home. For now, they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and they had to let him go. But Bridger's anger and defensiveness stuck with Hulk. It made him suspicious. And the fact that Bridger had insisted his wife would never have gotten out of her car for a stranger only reinforced Hulk's own theory. She might not have gotten out for a stranger, but she might have gotten out for you, Bridger. Or, Hulk thought, she might have gotten out for the police. Hulk already knew that no official Monroe police officers had pulled anyone over that night, but someone could have been pretending to be a police officer, a blue light bandit. That theory still made a lot of sense. Hulk thought about that bulletin that had gone out over the police radio 2 weeks ago, the one telling officers to be on the lookout for Kim's Jeep. Police radios were not private channels. Anyone with a simple police scanner could have been listening in. And what they would have heard was that a young woman named Kim often drove down this particular road all by herself late at night. They could have been waiting for her, knowing she was a vulnerable target. So Hulk picked up his phone and began calling around to other police departments in the region. He actually found out there had been 2 separate recent reports of blue light bandits harassing women. One of the culprits had already been caught, and he was in jail on the night Kim was killed, so it couldn't have been him. But the other suspect was still at large and had never been found. A couple of days later, on April 4th, Assistant Chief Bobby Hulk slammed his phone down in frustration and crossed another name off a list on his notepad. It had been 5 days since Kim's body was found, and all the initial leads he'd had were turning into dead ends. His team had tracked down surveillance footage from the night of Kim's disappearance. There was no sign of Bridger's truck driving through town until well after 4 a.m., after Kim's Jeep had already been found by Captain Simpson. It seemed the officer who claimed to have seen Bridger's truck at 2:30 a.m. had simply been mistaken, just as Bridger had furiously insisted. So Bridger's alibi was solid. Hulk had also reached out to Kim's manager and coworkers at the bar, thinking maybe her killer was a patron who had followed her. But none of them knew of any problems or issues she'd had with any customers. Meanwhile, Hulk's team had located and spoken to a man who worked the night shift at a business near where Kim's Jeep had been found. He said he had left work a little before 3 a.m. on the night Kim disappeared. As he was waiting to turn onto Old Charlotte Highway, he saw her red Jeep drive past. And right behind it, he saw another car that had been going in the opposite direction make a sudden, sharp 3-point turn and speed off after the Jeep. The man said this other car had lights on the roof and reflective tape on the back. He had assumed it was a police car, but he didn't get a good look at the markings. Now, Hulk knew for a fact that every single Monroe police officer who was on duty that night was accounted for, and none of them had pulled anyone over at the time Kim went missing. However, this new witness testimony certainly did support the theory that Kim's killer was posing as a police officer. It supported the blue light bandit theory. So Hulk had spent the last couple of days trying to track down any witnesses who had seen that other blue light bandit, the one who was recently reported in a nearby town but had never been caught. But he kept coming up dry. No one knew anything that could help him track down that suspect. It really seemed like the investigation was grinding to a halt. But then Hulk's phone rang. He answered it. It was an expert from the forensics lab. He had just finished analyzing the shoe print that had been found on Kim's sweatshirt. Hulk leaned forward in his chair, a feeling of nervous anticipation washing over him as the expert told him the results. And when he heard what the expert had to say, Hulk knew exactly how to find Kim's killer. Based on that shoe print, witness testimony, and other forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Kim Medlin on the 29th of March 1997. Around 3 a.m., the killer was driving down Old Charlotte Highway. They had been out prowling for hours, sometimes pulling over young women for minor traffic violations, sometimes for no reason at all, just to exert their authority. And as they drove, they saw a familiar red Jeep pass by. The killer had seen that Jeep driving down this same road several nights a week for the past couple of weeks. They had become obsessed with the young blonde woman who drove it. And tonight, they decided it was finally time to act on that obsession. So they pulled an abrupt, aggressive 3-point turn, raced up behind the Jeep, and flipped on their car's flashing blue and red lights. A moment later, the red Jeep pulled over onto the shoulder as expected. The killer got out of their car and walked up to the driver's side window. The woman inside, Kim, rolled down her window. She handed over her driver's license, and then she politely asked what the problem was. The killer didn't answer her question. Instead, they just told her to get out of the car. Kim was visibly confused, but she was dealing with a police officer, so she did as she was told. The moment she was out of the car, the killer slapped a pair of handcuffs onto her wrists, dragged her over to their patrol car, and shoved her into the back seat. Then, the killer got back in their own driver's seat as Kim started crying in the back, insisting that she hadn't done anything wrong, asking why she was being arrested. But the killer wasn't listening. Their mind was racing. They realized that even though they had been fantasizing about this moment for weeks, they hadn't actually planned what to do next. So, after a moment, they pulled their car over to the side of the road and just idled for a minute trying to figure out their next move. And then, an idea came to them. They put the car in drive and continued down the highway, turning onto a secluded dead-end road. As they drove down this dark road, Kim, in the back seat, suddenly went very quiet. The killer noticed the silence and looked in the rearview mirror. They saw her moving around, fiddling with something behind her back. And then the killer realized, with a jolt of panic, that in all their excitement, they had forgotten to engage the child's safety locks on the rear doors. The killer immediately reached for the power lock button on their own door, but it was too late. The rear door flew open, and Kim jumped out of the moving car. The killer slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a hard stop. They leaped out and ran back towards Kim, who was lying in the middle of the road, her hands still cuffed behind her back. Without even thinking, the killer raised their heavy-duty flashlight and smashed it into the side of Kim's head. Then they stomped on her back, breaking her neck. But the killer wasn't done. They knelt down, put the long metal flashlight against Kim's throat, and then pulled back on both ends, creating a makeshift garrote. They pulled as hard as they could, until Kim stopped moving. After she was dead, they dragged her body off the road and deep into the woods. There, they removed the handcuffs and hastily covered her body with loose branches and debris they found nearby. Then, the killer went home and meticulously cleaned their car, making sure there was no evidence that would tie them to the murder. But they didn't realize they had left behind one crucial, damning piece of evidence at the scene, that shoe print on Kim's sweatshirt. The print had a very distinct V-shaped pattern on its tread, which made it very easy for forensics to identify. Weeks later, the crime lab traced that print back to a specific shoe made by the Thorogood Company, a well-known supplier of military and uniform footwear. And that particular model of shoe happened to be the exact same one that was issued to every officer in the Monroe Public Safety Department. Kim's killer was not just posing as a police officer. They were a real police officer. The killer was Officer Josh Griffin, the off-duty rookie cop who claimed he had simply responded to a car in a ditch and then gone home a half an hour before Kim went missing. It would later turn out that Josh had learned all the details about Kim's vehicle and her late-night driving patterns from his own father, Officer Roger Griffin. After his father and Captain Simpson had responded to Kim's road rage complaint on March 15th, Roger had casually told his son about the incident. And from that moment, Josh had become obsessed. He had been on the lookout for Kim's Jeep ever since, just waiting for his chance. Josh Griffin was arrested on the 30th of May, 1997, about 2 months after Kim's murder. He was eventually convicted of first-degree kidnapping and first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. As for his motive, the prosecution argued that he had become fixated on Kim after hearing about her from his father and, in an act of horrific violence, decided to abduct and kill her. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. We like to think that we are in complete control of our lives. We make plans, we set goals, and we follow a routine day after day, expecting everything to go exactly the way we want it to. But the truth is, we are all just one random event away from having our entire world turned completely upside down. Sometimes these events are incredibly terrifying. Other times they seem like complete accidents of fate. But every once in a while, something happens that is so wild, so incredibly unlikely, that if you saw it in a movie, you would probably shake your head and say there is no way that could ever happen in real life. Today, I am going to tell you 3 stories about real people who had something totally unexpected and insane happen to them. These are stories of survival, of passion, and of resilience in the face of absolute disaster. These are the kinds of stories that are truly stranger than fiction. These events did not just change their lives in an instant, but in some of these cases, they went on to change the lives of millions of other people all around the world. We will explore how their choices shaped their paths. These stories are a slight departure from what we normally do on this channel, but they still have that same mysterious, gripping feeling that keeps you wondering what is going to happen next. So, if you enjoy these types of narratives, let me know in the comments and we will definitely do more of them. But before we dive into these incredible events, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, delivered in a straightforward storytelling format, then you have definitely come to the right place, because that is exactly what we do here, and we upload new episodes once a week. If that sounds like something you would enjoy, please go ahead and put glitter inside the like buttons, car vents, so that the very next time they turn on their air conditioning, they get a giant, sparkling surprise blown all over the inside of their car. Also, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you never miss any of our weekly stories. Now, let us get right into today's first story. It was the afternoon of the 9th of July, 2001. A 13-year-old boy named Cody Clausen was walking through a dense stretch of woods near Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Cody was carrying a heavy bag of camping supplies, and his shoulders were starting to ache from the weight. He had come out to these rugged woods for a weekend camping trip with his father and the rest of his local Boy Scout troop. About 30 minutes earlier, Cody had decided to break off from the main group. They were all set up at their primary campsite, but Cody realized they had left some very important gear back in his father's truck. Since the truck was parked a couple of miles away, Cody volunteered to hike back alone to grab the extra supplies. He made it to the truck without any issues, loaded up his bag, and turned right back around to head back to camp. As Cody hiked along the dirt path, he let his mind wander. He was not really paying attention to his surroundings. Instead, he was daydreaming about the campfire that night. He was trying to come up with the perfect spooky story to tell the other scouts to impress them and show them how tough he was. But as he kept walking and thinking, a strange feeling started to creep over him. He stopped walking and looked around. He realized that the trees and the rocks did not look familiar at all. He had been walking for quite a long time, and by his calculations, he should have reached the campsite by now. At first, Cody did not panic. He was a Boy Scout, after all. He told himself that he must have just taken a wrong turn somewhere when he was lost in thought. He figured the smartest thing to do would be to simply retrace his steps, head back to his father's truck, and start the hike over again. That way, he would at least know exactly where he was, even if he ended up being really late getting back to the camp. But as he turned around and started walking, he quickly realized he had no idea which way he had come from. The forest was thick, and because he had not been paying attention, he had drifted far off the main trail. Within minutes, Cody knew he was completely lost, and a cold wave of panic began to settle in his chest. Hours went by. Cody walked frantically through the dense wilderness, desperately calling out for his father or anyone else who might hear him. But the only sound returning to him was the rustling of the leaves in the wind. To make matters worse, as the afternoon started to fade into evening, the sky began to turn a dark, angry purple. Huge storm clouds were rolling over the mountains. Cody knew that a cold night in the Yellowstone wilderness during a storm could easily become life-threatening. But he tried to stay positive. He told himself that his dad and the scout leaders definitely knew he was missing by now. They were probably already setting up a massive search party to find him. But Cody also knew that the wilderness was vast, and it could take them hours or even days to locate him. The thought of spending days out here alone was absolutely terrifying. He took a deep breath, calmed his heart rate down, and decided to rely on his scout training. He needed to build a shelter, find some food and water, and make a fire to keep warm until help arrived. He found a relatively flat spot beneath a tree, sat down, and dumped the contents of his heavy supply bag onto the dirt. But when he looked at what he had brought from the truck, his stomach dropped. None of the items were going to help him survive. There was no gear for building a shelter, no matches to light a fire, no food, and only a tiny bottle of water that was already almost empty. He essentially had nothing. Right at that moment, the sky opened up and a violent thunderstorm began. Cold rain and heavy hail started pounding down through the tree canopy. Lightning flashed, and thunder shook the ground beneath his feet. Terrified and freezing, Cody shoved what he could back into his bag, stood up, and just started running blindly through the dark forest, desperate to find any kind of cover. Then, a massive bolt of lightning illuminated the entire area for a split second. In that brief flash, Cody saw the dark opening of a cave right ahead of him. He scrambled over the wet rocks, threw himself inside the cave, and curled up on the hard, dry ground. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, Cody was shivering and crying. He was so overwhelmed by fear and physical exhaustion that his brain simply shut down. He closed his eyes and drifted off into a deep sleep, wondering if he would ever see his family again. The next morning, Cody woke up and crawled to the mouth of the cave. The storm had finally passed, and the sun was beginning to peek through the trees. But before he could even think about what to do next, he heard a faint, distant chopping sound. It was the unmistakable sound of a helicopter. Cody ran out of the cave into a small clearing and looked up. Sure enough, there was a small helicopter flying low over the tree line, scanning the area. Cody knew he had to act fast before the helicopter flew away. He remembered a trick from his Boy Scout survival manual. He quickly unbuckled his belt, held up the shiny metal buckle, and angled it toward the sun, trying to reflect the bright sunlight directly at the helicopter cockpit. It worked perfectly. The helicopter suddenly tilted, turned in his direction, and began to hover directly above him. The pilot waved through the glass and started looking for a clearing nearby to land the aircraft. Cody was so overwhelmed with joy that he grabbed his bag and ran as fast as he could toward the clearing where the helicopter was descending. He watched as the skids touched down on the grass. Cody did not wait. He ran up to the passenger side, threw the door open, and climbed inside. The pilot turned to him, looked him in the eye, and calmly said, "Good morning." Cody was in such a state of shock and relief that he could barely speak. But when he actually looked at the face of the man who had just saved his life, his jaw dropped. He could not believe who was sitting in the pilot's seat. It turned out that the night before, when Cody did not return, his father had immediately contacted the local authorities. A massive search and rescue operation was launched, and several volunteers from the surrounding area offered to help. One of those volunteers was an amateur helicopter pilot who happened to live nearby and wanted to assist in the search. That pilot had flown 10 miles away from the original campsite to find Cody. And that pilot was none other than Harrison Ford, the legendary actor who played Han Solo in Star Wars and Indiana Jones. When Harrison Ford flew Cody back to the search headquarters and reunited him with his father, his dad assumed Cody would want to go straight home to recover from the trauma. But Cody looked at his dad and said that he wanted to go right back to the Boy Scout camp. He wanted to sit around the campfire and tell the other scouts exactly what had happened to him, because he now had a campfire story that absolutely none of them would ever believe. Now, let us move on to our second story, which takes us across the Atlantic Ocean and back in time to September of 1954. A 14-year-old boy named Rich was slowly shuffling his way down the long, sterile hallway of a children's hospital in England. Rich was incredibly weak, and he coughed and wheezed with almost every single step he took. He was walking alongside several other sick children, and they were all heading toward a small classroom located inside the hospital. Rich did not know what kind of lesson they were going to have that day, and honestly, he did not really care. Anything was better than sitting alone in his cramped hospital room, staring at the walls and being bored out of his mind. Rich was in the hospital because he was suffering from tuberculosis, an infectious lung disease. Over the previous 10 weeks, he had been transferred to several different hospitals as doctors tried to treat his condition. In fact, his illness was so severe that the medical staff had recently sat his parents down and told them that Rich might have to remain hospitalized for up to 2 more years. This was a nightmare for a young boy, But unfortunately, being stuck in a hospital was nothing new to Rich. When he was just 6 years old, his appendix had burst, leading to a massive internal infection that put him into a coma for several weeks. After waking up from the coma, he had to spend nearly an entire year in a hospital bed just to recover from the ordeal. All of these prolonged hospital stays had a devastating impact on Rich's life, especially when it came to his education. He had fallen incredibly far behind in his schoolwork. Because his family was very poor and lived in a tough working-class neighborhood, they could never afford to hire a private tutor to help him catch up. As a result, Rich's entire education consisted of whatever random basic classes the various hospitals happened to offer. Sometimes a teacher would come in to teach them how to weave baskets or maybe how to do basic woodworking. It was not much of an education, but it was all he had. So, on that afternoon in 1954, when Rich walked into the hospital classroom, he had incredibly low expectations. He assumed it would be another boring activity just to pass the time. But the moment he stepped through the door, his eyes lit up. Sitting at the front of the room was a visiting music teacher, and scattered all around the teacher were various musical instruments. Ever since he was a little boy, Rich had dreamed of playing the drums. He remembered walking past a music store window years ago, staring at a beautiful drum set and wishing more than anything that he could play it. But his family could never afford such a luxury. Now, looking at the instruments in the classroom, Rich realized this might be his only chance. When the teacher started handing out instruments to the children, Rich did not wait. He marched right up and demanded the drum. He told the teacher he would not play anything else. The teacher smiled and handed him a simple snare drum and a pair of wooden sticks. That day, the teacher tried to lead the room of sick children through a few simple songs. The resulting noise was absolutely terrible. None of the kids knew what they were doing, and the music was objectively awful. But to Rich, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. By the time the class ended, he felt completely energized. He had not suddenly become a master drummer in 1 hour, but he had discovered a massive, burning passion for the instrument. He decided right then and there that since he was going to be trapped in this hospital for the foreseeable future, he was going to spend every single second practicing. The very next day, Rich snuck into a hospital utility closet and found some long wooden sticks that the nurses normally used for knitting. Those became his makeshift drumsticks. For the next year and a half, Rich used those knitting needles to beat a rhythm onto every single surface he could find. He drummed on his bedside table, he drummed on the metal radiator, he drummed on his own knees, and he drummed on the floor. Every few weeks, when the music teacher returned to the hospital, Rich would be the first one in the classroom, eager to learn anything he could. In 1955, at the age of 16, Rich was finally released from the hospital. He was completely cured of tuberculosis. But even though he had his health back, his life did not suddenly become easy. His family was still deeply in debt, and Rich could not afford to go back to school. Instead, he had to immediately get a full-time job working in a local factory to help his family pay the bills. Rich did not complain. He knew it was his duty to help his family, and he accepted his reality. But he never let go of his dream. Even while working long, grueling hours at the factory, he would grab pieces of wood and drum on the machinery during his breaks. He found joy in rhythm whenever and wherever he could. Then, on Christmas of 1956, everything changed. Rich's stepfather had secretly been working extra shifts and saving every spare penny he had for months. On Christmas morning, he surprised Rich with a real, actual drum kit of his own. Rich was so emotional he could barely contain himself. It was the greatest gift he had ever received. He began practicing constantly, and before long, he started playing with small local bands in his spare time. He quickly earned a reputation around town as one of the most talented and reliable drummers in the area. A few years later, a highly popular local band had a sudden falling out with their drummer and fired him. They needed a replacement fast, and since Rich was the best drummer around, they approached him and asked if he would join them. Rich immediately accepted. By that point, Rich had started using a stage name, Ringo Starr. And the band that had just hired him to be their new drummer was none other than the Beatles. Our third story takes us to the morning of Sunday, the 20th of October, 1991. A 31-year-old man named Will woke up next to his wife in their beautiful home in Oakland, California. As soon as Will opened his eyes, he noticed a sharp, pungent smell in the air. It was the smell of wood smoke. Will got out of bed, walked over to the bedroom window, and pulled back the curtains. When he looked out toward the horizon, he saw a massive, thick plume of black smoke rising into the sky just beyond the edge of his neighborhood. Because wildfires are a frequent and dangerous reality in California, Will immediately became concerned. He picked up the phone and dialed 911 to report what he was seeing. But the dispatcher told him that the fire department was already all over it. The dispatcher explained that there had been a wildfire on the nearby mountainside about 600 feet away, but it had already been put out. The smoke he was seeing was simply the leftover remains. Relieved, Will went about his normal morning routine. As he brushed his teeth and took a shower, his mind began to wander toward his work. Will was a software developer, and he was in the middle of working on a video game about ants and how they build their homes. He was really excited about this project, designing the virtual colonies in his head as he got dressed. But when Will looked out the window again, his heart stopped. The small plume of smoke had turned into a massive cloud of black soot, and he could see huge orange flames licking up over the trees. The wind had picked up, and the fire was moving directly toward his neighborhood at an incredibly fast speed. Will immediately called 911 again. He could tell from the dispatcher's voice that they were caught off guard and did not realize the fire had flared back up. Will knew he could not wait for help. He grabbed his wife, packed a few bare necessities, and ran out the front door. The street was filled with chaos and thick smoke. Neighbors were frantically loading their cars and preparing to flee. As they were about to speed away, Will suddenly remembered their next-door neighbors. The couple who lived there had gone away for the weekend, leaving their elderly parents to watch after their 2-year-old child. Because the grandparents did not have a car, they were completely trapped. Will ran over, pounded on their door, and helped the terrified grandparents carry the toddler to his car. He stepped on the gas and drove through the blinding smoke to safety. A week later, Will returned to his neighborhood with a police escort. When he got out of the car, he looked at where his house used to be, and it was completely gone. Every house in the neighborhood was leveled. The Oakland Hills firestorm had burned for 4 days, destroying thousands of homes and killing 25 people. Will walked through the rubble of his home. As he stood there surveying the destruction, he was hit with a powerful wave of clarity. He did not care that he had lost all of his possessions. He was just incredibly grateful that his family and his neighbors had survived. As he looked down at the ash at his feet, he noticed a group of ants. Despite the devastating fire, they had survived underground, and they were already busy gathering supplies and rebuilding their colony. This sight gave Will a brilliant idea. He realized that the game he was making should not just be about ants. It should be about how people survive, adapt, and rebuild after tragedies. 9 years later, Will finally released his new video game. But it was not the original game about ants. Instead, inspired by the resilience of those tiny insects in the ruins of his home, he created a game where players could build digital houses, design neighborhoods, and guide characters through simulated lives. But he kept the game realistic by including unpredictable disasters like fires, showing that no matter what happens, you must move forward and rebuild. The game became a massive global success, selling tens of millions of copies worldwide. Will's full name was Will Wright, and the game he created was The Sims. All 3 of these incredible stories share a common thread. They show us how fragile our daily lives truly are, and how a single moment can change everything we thought we knew about our future. Whether it is a 13-year-old boy getting lost in the deep wilderness of Yellowstone during a massive storm, or a sick 14-year-old boy facing years of isolation in a hospital bed, or a young software developer watching his entire home turn to ash in a historic firestorm. In each of these situations, it would have been incredibly easy for these individuals to give up. They were facing overwhelming odds, physical danger, and immense emotional pain. But instead of letting despair take over, they kept moving forward, one small step at a time. Cody Clausen relied on his Boy Scout training and kept his calm, leading to a miraculous rescue by one of the most famous Hollywood actors in the world. Richard Starkey found a deep passion for the drums while recovering in a hospital bed, practicing on radiators and tabletops with knitting needles until he eventually became Ringo Starr and joined the most famous rock band in history. And Will Wright watched a resilient colony of ants rebuild in the ruins of his destroyed Oakland home, inspiring him to create a digital universe that would change the entire entertainment industry forever. These stories remind us that life is completely unpredictable, and while we cannot control the disasters that strike us, we can control how we respond to them. The next time you find yourself facing an obstacle that feels completely insurmountable, or a tragedy that seems to tear your world apart, think about these three people. Remember the scout in the cave, the boy with his knitting needles, and the developer watching the ants. They show us that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. We just have to keep moving forward, finding the strength to rebuild, and waiting to see what the next chapter has in store for us. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Think about the physical spaces you occupy throughout your everyday life. We move through our world with a deep sense of comfort and routine, never expecting that the ground we walk on, the homes we live in, or the natural places we visit could suddenly turn against us. We trust our surroundings. We believe that if we are familiar with a path, a room, or a landscape, we are safe. But the reality is that danger can hide in the most mundane places, waiting for a single misstep or a brief moment of distraction. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible and tragic stories of people who stepped into places they were never supposed to be, leading to unexpected and devastating outcomes. Our first story takes us to a small, quiet village in central India, surrounded by dusty fields and narrow dirt roads. It was late on the night of Friday, the 18th of September 2015. A 45-year-old man named Later Barman was walking down a road. He was not walking in a straight line. In fact, he was stumbling. Later was extremely drunk. Earlier that evening, Later and his wife had gone to a local festival, a fair in their area. They had spent hours walking around, enjoying the music, the colorful stalls, the food, and especially the drinks. They had a lot to drink. Later was known in the village as a friendly, hard-working man, but he was also someone who loved to drink, and sometimes he did not know when to stop. As the night went on, his wife started to feel tired. She decided she wanted to go visit her parents who lived in a neighboring village. She suggested they head out together, but Later was not ready to go home. He was in a great mood, and he wanted to keep the fun rolling. So, his wife decided to leave for her parents' house, thinking Later would head home shortly after. Later, however, stayed behind. He walked over to a local liquor store and bought even more alcohol. He sat there and drank until he was heavily intoxicated. By the time he finally decided to walk home, it was late at night, and he could barely keep his balance. He began the long, slow stumble back to his house. But the problem was, this village did not have streetlights. When the sun went down, the streets became completely black. Later could only see maybe a foot or two in front of him. But Later had lived in this village for his entire life. He had walked this exact road hundreds of times in the dark, so he felt confident he could find his way back. He staggered along, guided mostly by muscle memory and the faint silhouette of trees against the night sky. He was focusing hard on his balance, his head spinning from all the alcohol he had consumed. He did not even notice how cold the night air was becoming. As he walked, he started to notice some unusual things. He could hear people talking in the distance. He heard the deep rumbling of engines and saw faint lights flickering through the darkness. It seemed like there was a lot of activity on the road, which was strange for that time of night. But because he was so drunk, Later did not think to stop and investigate. He assumed it was just people hanging out or some cars driving by. He kept pushing forward, trying to keep his footing on the uneven dirt road. And then, suddenly, everything changed. Later took a step forward, expecting his foot to hit the solid ground. But there was nothing there. He stepped directly into empty air. Before he could react, he fell face first into a deep, dark hole. The impact was violent. He hit the bottom hard, his head smashing against the ground, and he was instantly knocked unconscious. Later lay there, silent and hidden in the shadows of the deep pit. Fast forward to the next morning. It was a bright, sunny Saturday. A group of local villagers were walking down the very same road that Later had taken the night before. As they walked, they were enjoying the morning air when they noticed something strange sitting right in the middle of the road. From a distance, they could not make out what it was. It looked like a dark, irregular shape protruding from the ground. They walked closer to investigate, and as they got within a few feet, they realized what they were looking at. They screamed in terror and ran to find the police. What they saw was a human hand sticking straight up out of the asphalt. It turns out the road Later was walking on was notorious for having massive, dangerous potholes. For months, the villagers had complained about them. Finally, the local government had sent a construction crew to repair the road. Because it was a main road, the crew decided to work late at night when there was very little traffic. This was the noise and the lights that Later had heard and seen while he was walking home. As Later stumbled along in his drunken state, he had walked right into one of these deep, open potholes that the crew had prepared for filling. When he fell, he was knocked cold at the bottom of the pit. Because the construction site was dark, chaotic, and filled with heavy machinery, none of the workers noticed that a man had fallen into the hole. A short time later, the crew reached that exact pothole. They did not look inside. Instead, they poured a massive load of boiling molten tar directly into the hole, completely burying Later underneath it. Then they drove a heavy road roller over the spot to flatten it out and seal the road. Investigators believe that at some point, the heat of the tar or the pressure of the roller may have briefly woken Later up. In his final agonizing moments, he tried to claw his way out of the suffocating hot liquid. He managed to push his hand up through the tar, reaching toward the sky, but he could not pull the rest of his body out. He died, trapped beneath the fresh asphalt. Following the discovery, Later's body was carefully removed from the road, and he was given a proper burial by his family. The police launched an investigation into the construction company, and 2 of the workers who were on duty that night were arrested and charged with culpable homicide. The local authorities offered Later's grieving family a compensation payment, but it was only worth about $760. It was a tragic, senseless end to a man who was just trying to walk home on a dark night. Now, let us move to our second story, which takes us to the rural town of Huron, California. This is an extremely rural and isolated area where houses are spread far apart, surrounded by open fields and dusty roads. The date is the 28th of November, 2015. At around 2:30 in the afternoon, a man pulled his car into his driveway. He had been away from his house overnight, and he was eager to get inside and relax. But as soon as he stepped out of his car, his anxiety began to rise. The neighborhood he lived in was not safe. In fact, over the course of the previous year, his home had been broken into multiple times. Each time, the thieves had stolen some of his belongings, leaving him feeling violated and unsafe in his own home. But the problem was, this man could not call the police. He was wanted by the authorities on an active warrant for felony drug possession. If he called the police to report a break-in, they would run his name, find the warrant, and arrest him on the spot. So, he had to take his security into his own hands. He had developed a strict routine that he followed every single time he came home. He walked up to his porch and grabbed the doorknob, checking to see if it was still locked. It was, which gave him a small sigh of relief. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. But he did not just walk into his living room. Instead, he stood perfectly still in the entryway. He held his breath and listened. He was listening for any creak of a floorboard, any sound of breathing, or any sign that someone was hiding in his house. The house was completely silent. He walked in, flipped on the lights, and put his keys and wallet down on the table. But he still was not satisfied. He began a systematic, room-by-room sweep of his entire home. He checked the windows to make sure none of them were broken. He went to the kitchen and checked the back door, confirming it was still locked. He looked around his dining room. Everything seemed to be in order. He did notice that some mail sitting on a table looked a bit messy, as if someone might have flipped through it. But then he remembered that he had been in a rush the night before, and he might have just left it like that himself. He decided he was being overly paranoid. He took a deep breath, walked into the living room, sat down on his couch, and turned on the television. For a few minutes, he started to relax. He felt glad that his house was secure and that nothing had been disturbed. But as he sat there, he realized the house was very cold. He started to shiver. He got up from the couch, walked over to his thermostat, and turned on his heating system. Then he sat back down, waiting for the house to warm up. Only a minute later, a terrifying, high-pitched scream ripped through the silence of the house. The homeowner was absolutely terrified. He had no idea where the sound was coming from. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls or perhaps from the fireplace. He ran over to investigate, and the screams grew louder and more desperate. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, and it made his stomach turn. It turns out the man's fears about his home being targeted were entirely correct. The night before, while he was away, a 19-year-old man named Cody Caldwell had decided to burglarize the house. But instead of trying to force open a window or a door, Cody had climbed onto the roof. He had spotted the chimney and decided he could slide down it to gain access to the house. Cody thought this was a brilliant plan, but he had made a fatal mistake. Chimneys are not wide, straight chutes. They often narrow significantly near the bottom. As Cody slid down, he got completely wedged about halfway down the chimney. He could not move up, and he could not move down. His arms were pinned tightly to his sides, and the rough brick walls scraped against his skin. Every time he tried to wriggle free, he only slid deeper and tighter into the narrow brick passage. He was trapped in the pitch-black, suffocating space for hours. When the homeowner returned the next afternoon and performed his security sweep, Cody was still alive and trapped inside the chimney. But Cody had remained completely silent. Perhaps he was too exhausted from hours of struggling to scream, or perhaps he was terrified that if he made a noise, the homeowner would find him and attack him or call the police. He simply stayed quiet, hoping the homeowner would leave the house again so he could find a way to make noise for help. But when the homeowner turned on the heat, he did not realize that his heating system was connected to a fireplace that immediately ignited a fire at the base of the chimney. The moment the fire started, thick, hot smoke and intense heat began to rise up the chimney, straight toward Cody. Cody began to choke and panic. In his desperation to escape the rising heat and toxic carbon monoxide, he began to thrash around. But his frantic movements only caused him to lose his footing and slip further down into the narrowing chimney, closer and closer to the growing flames. Within seconds, the heat became unbearable. Cody was caught in the direct path of the fire. The scream the homeowner heard was the sound of Cody burning alive inside the chimney. The homeowner tried frantically to put the fire out, but by the time he managed to extinguish it and emergency services arrived, it was far too late. Cody had succumbed to severe burns and smoke inhalation. He died inside the chimney, trapped in the very place he had tried to use to break into a home. It was a horrific tragedy that shocked the local community and left the homeowner traumatized by the memory of those desperate screams. Now, let us move to our third and final story, which takes us to the edge of a frozen river in St. Petersburg, Russia. The date is the 19th of January, 2022. It is late in the evening, and a 40-year-old mother named Anna Uskova is standing in a clearing in the woods. The weather is brutal. It is the dead of winter in Russia, and the temperature is well below freezing. Snow is falling heavily, and a biting wind is cutting through the trees. But despite the freezing conditions, Anna and her family are out here for a very specific reason. They are preparing to perform a sacred religious ceremony. In Russia, January 19th is the day of the Orthodox Epiphany. On this day, thousands of people across the country participate in a purification ritual. The ritual involves carving a cross-shaped hole into the thick ice of a frozen body of water. Participants then jump into the freezing water, dunk themselves 3 times in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and then climb back out. It is believed that this ritual washes away sins, strengthens the body, and protects the soul from evil spirits for the coming year. Usually, Anna and her family would perform this ritual with their local church community. The church would organize a large event, choosing a safe location, setting up wooden steps into the water, and ensuring that medical staff and rescue divers were on standby just in case anything went wrong. But this year, Anna wanted something different. She wanted a quiet, intimate ceremony with just her husband and her young children. She felt that doing it privately in the beautiful, snow-covered woods would make the experience more spiritual and memorable for her kids. They had found what they thought was the perfect spot next to the frozen Oradezh River. When they arrived, they were surprised to find that they were completely alone in the beautiful, peaceful woods. Anna set up some lights and a video camera on a tripod to record the moment. In the video, Anna walks into the frame, kneels down to comfort her shivering, nervous kids, and promises to go first to show them how easy it is. She walks to the edge of the cross-shaped hole, makes the sign of the cross over her chest, and jumps feet first into the dark water. She plunged under and disappeared. Seconds passed with no sign of her, and her family began to scream. What they did not realize was that the river had a raging, powerful undercurrent flowing beneath the ice. The moment Anna jumped, the fast-flowing current grabbed her legs and pulled her sideways under the thick, solid ice sheet. She was trapped in the pitch-black, freezing water with no way to find her way back to the opening. Her husband rushed to the hole and jumped in, but the freezing water and strong current forced him to climb back out to avoid being swept away too. Rescue divers and local authorities searched the river for hours under the ice, but it was a hopeless task. Anna's body has never been recovered. The video of her final moments remains a chilling reminder of how quickly a beautiful family tradition can turn into a tragedy when basic safety is ignored. These 3 stories show us that danger is not always where we expect it to be. Sometimes it is hidden beneath a familiar road, inside the walls of our own homes, or beneath the beautiful, serene ice of a quiet river. It is a sobering reminder that our world is full of hidden hazards, and a single decision to step into an unfamiliar or unsafe place can change everything in an instant.